Chapter 1: The Idea of Multiple Intelligences. A young girl spends an hour with an examiner, facing a number of questions that probe her store of information, her vocabulary, her arithmetic skills, and her ability to remember a series of numbers. She is asked who discovered America and what the stomach does, the meaning of words like nonsense and belfry, and the cost of 3 candy bars at 8 cents each. Her capacity to grasp similarities is tested with pairs like elbow and knee, or mountain and lake. She might also be asked to solve a maze or arrange a group of pictures to tell a complete story. Sometime afterward, the examiner scores her responses and arrives at a single number, her intelligence quotient, or IQ. This number is likely to have an appreciable effect on her future, influencing how her teachers perceive her and determining her eligibility for certain privileges. While the importance attached to this number is not entirely inappropriate, as an IQ score does predict an ability to handle school subjects, it foretells little of success in later life. This scenario is repeated thousands of times every day across the world, and a great deal of significance is typically attached to that single score. Though different versions of the test are used for various ages and in diverse cultural settings, and it is sometimes administered with paper and pencil rather than through an interchange with an examiner, the broad outlines remain consistent. An hour's worth of questions yields one round number, and this is pretty much the way of intelligence testing the world around. Many observers are not happy with this state of affairs. There must be more to intelligence than short answers to short questions that predict academic success. Yet, in the absence of a better way of thinking about intelligence, and of better ways to assess an individual's capabilities, this scenario is destined to be repeated universally for the foreseeable future. But what if one were to let one's imagination wander freely, to consider the wider range of performances that are in fact valued throughout the world? Consider, for example, the 12-year-old male Puluwat in the Caroline Islands, selected by his elders to become a master sailor, learning to combine knowledge of stars, geography, and sailing to navigate hundreds of islands. Consider the 15-year-old Iranian youth who has memorized the entire Quran, mastered Arabic, and is now being sent to a holy city to work with an Ayatollah who will prepare him as a religious leader. Or consider the 14-year-old in Paris who has learned to program a computer and is beginning to compose music with a synthesizer. A moment's reflection reveals that each of these individuals is attaining a high level of competence in a challenging field and should, by any reasonable definition, be seen as exhibiting intelligent behavior. Yet it is equally clear that current methods of assessing intellect are not honed enough to assess potential in navigating by the stars, mastering a foreign tongue, or composing with a computer. The problem lies less in the technology of testing than in our customary ways of thinking about the intellect and our ingrained views of intelligence. Only by expanding and reformulating our view of what counts as human intellect can we devise more appropriate ways of assessing it and more effective ways of educating it. Around the world, many in education are reaching similar conclusions. There is interest in new programs that seek to develop human intelligence for a whole culture or to train individuals in general skills like anticipatory learning. Intriguing experiments, from the Suzuki method of training violin to the Logo method of computer programming, seek to elicit accomplished performances from young children. Some of these experiments have had demonstrated success, while others are still in pilot phases. Yet it is just to say that the successes, as well as the failures, have occurred in the absence of an adequate framework for thinking about intelligences. Certainly, no existing view of intelligence incorporates the range of abilities just surveyed. To arrive at such a formulation is the purpose of the present book. The chapters that follow will outline a new theory of human intellectual competences, one that challenges the classical view of intelligence most of us have absorbed. To better identify the new features of this theory, it is helpful to first consider the traditional view, where it came from, why it has become so entrenched, and what issues remain unresolved. For well over 2,000 years, since the rise of the Greek city-state, a certain set of ideas has dominated discussions of the human condition in our civilization. This collection of ideas stresses the importance of mental powers, capacities variously termed rationality, intelligence, or the deployment of mind. The search for an essence of humanity has led to a focus on our species' quest for knowledge. Whether it is Plato's philosopher king, the Hebrew prophet, or the modern scientist, the individual capable of using his mental powers has been singled out. Socrates' "Know thyself," Aristotle's "All men by nature desire to know," and Descartes' "I think, therefore I am," provide epigraphs that frame an entire civilization. Even in the medieval period, St. Augustine declared that the prime mover of the universe is intelligence. Dante later wrote that the proper function of the human race is to actualize continually the entire capacity of the intellect. And at the dawn of the Renaissance, Francis Bacon described a utopian institution whose end was the knowledge of causes and secret motions of things. Of course, esteem for knowledge is not the only theme in the Western world. The virtues of feeling, faith, and courage have also been leitmotifs, sometimes contrasted with the quest for knowledge. What is instructive is that even when faith or love is extolled, each is typically opposed to the powers of reason, which is a kind of perverse complement to those very powers. Reason, intelligence, logic, and knowledge are not synonymous, and much of this book constitutes an effort to tease out the various skills and capacities that have been too easily combined under the rubric of the mental. First, however, a different kind of distinction must be introduced, a contrast between two attitudes toward mind that have competed across the centuries. Adopting the distinction of the Greek poet Archilochus, one can contrast the hedgehogs, who view all intellect as a single piece, with the foxes, who favor its fragmentation into several components. Hedgehogs tend to believe in a singular, inviolable capacity, often imposing the corollary that each person is born with a certain amount of intelligence and can be rank-ordered by IQ. So entrenched is this way of thinking that most of us readily lapse into rankings of individuals as more or less smart. An equally venerable tradition, however, glorifies the numerous distinct functions of the mind. Classical thinkers differentiated between reason, will, and feeling, while medieval thinkers had their trivium and quadrivium. As psychology was launched, an even larger array of mental faculties was posited. This debate between the hedgehogs and the foxes continues today. In brain studies, there are the localizers, who believe different parts of the nervous system mediate diverse capacities, arrayed against the holists, who see intellectual functions as the property of the brain as a whole. In intelligence testing, a debate has raged between those who believe in a general factor of intellect and those who posit a family of primary mental abilities. Some long-standing issues, like the conflict between faith and reason, may never be resolved. In other cases, however, there may be hope for progress. Sometimes progress comes from logical clarification, as when the fallacy about El Greco's astigmatism was exposed. Sometimes it results from dramatic scientific findings, like the discoveries of Copernicus and Kepler. And sometimes progress comes about when a large body of information is woven together in a convincing tapestry of argument, as Charles Darwin did with his theory of evolution. The time may be at hand for such a clarification about the structure of human intellectual competence. In this case, there is neither a single scientific breakthrough nor an egregious logical blunder, but rather the confluence of a large body of evidence from a variety of sources. This confluence has been gathering force for decades, but the lines of convergence have rarely been systematically examined in one place. Such confrontation and collation are the twin purposes of this book. What follows is an argument for the persuasive evidence of several relatively autonomous human intellectual competences, abbreviated hereafter as human intelligences. These are the frames of mind of the title. While their exact nature and number have not been fixed, the conviction that they exist, are relatively independent, and can be combined in a multiplicity of adaptive ways is increasingly difficult to deny. Previous efforts to establish independent intelligences have been unconvincing because they relied on only one or two lines of evidence. My procedure is different. In formulating this brief on behalf of multiple intelligences, I have reviewed evidence from a large and hitherto unrelated group of sources, studies of prodigies, gifted individuals, brain-damaged patients, idiot savants, normal children and adults, experts, and individuals from diverse cultures. A preliminary list of candidate intelligences has been bolstered by converging evidence from these sources. An intelligence becomes a convincing candidate to the extent that it can be found in relative isolation in special populations, become highly developed in specific individuals or cultures, and be defined by core abilities. In ordinary life, these intelligences typically work in harmony, so their autonomy may be invisible. But when the appropriate observational lenses are donned, the peculiar nature of each intelligence emerges with surprising clarity. The major assignment in this book, then, is to make the case for the existence of multiple intelligences, or MI. But this volume also has other subsidiary purposes. It seeks to expand the purviews of cognitive and developmental psychology, looking toward both the biological roots of cognition and its cultural variations. It wishes to examine the educational implications of this theory, suggesting it should be possible to identify an individual's intellectual profile at an early age to enhance educational opportunities. It is also a hope that this inquiry will inspire anthropologists to develop models of how intellectual competences are fostered in various cultural settings. Finally, and most importantly, the hope is that this point of view may prove of genuine utility to policymakers and practitioners charged with the development of other individuals. Too often they have embraced flawed theories of intelligence, supporting programs that have accomplished little. To aid such individuals, I have developed a framework that can be applied to any educational situation. Part 2, the heart of the book, will describe several intellectual competences whose existence seems reasonably certain. Subsequent chapters will adopt a biological and cross-cultural perspective, and the concluding chapters will address questions of education and policy. A final word about the title of this chapter. The idea of multiple intelligences is an old one, and I can scarcely claim great originality for reviving it. By featuring the word idea, I want to underscore that this notion is hardly a proven scientific fact. It is, at most, an idea that has recently regained the right to be discussed seriously. Given the ambition and scope of this book, it is inevitable that this idea will harbor many shortcomings. What I hope to establish is that multiple intelligences is an idea whose time has come. Chapter 2, Intelligence, Earlier Views. As a schoolboy in the latter part of the 18th century, Franz Joseph Gall observed a relationship between the mental characteristics of his schoolmates and the shapes of their heads, noting, for instance, that boys with prominent eyes tended to have good memories. He clung to this idea as he became a physician and scientist, eventually placing it at the center of a discipline he called phrenology. The key idea was simple. Human skulls differ, and these variations reflect the size and shape of the brain. Since different areas of the brain subserve discrete functions, an expert could carefully examine skull configurations to determine an individual's mental profile of strengths, weaknesses, and idiosyncrasies. The resulting list of 37 powers and organs of the mind, modified by his colleague Joseph Spurzheim, was a mixed bag that included affective faculties like amativeness, sentiments like hope, and perceptual capacities for language, music, and color. Unsurprisingly, this simple doctrine achieved enormous popularity in Europe and the United States in the early 19th century, as it had an intrinsic appeal that allowed anyone to play the game, its credibility strengthened by the endorsement of many contemporary scientists. Armed with hindsight, one can readily spot the flaws in phrenology. There is no clear-cut correlation between the sheer size of a brain and an individual's intellect. Individuals with small brains like Walt Whitman have achieved great success, while those with massive brains are sometimes unremarkable. Furthermore, the skull is an inexact measure of the cortex's configuration. Yet, it would be fallacious to dismiss Gall's claims entirely. He was among the first modern scientists to stress that different parts of the brain mediate different functions. He also proposed the fascinating idea that general mental powers like perception and memory do not exist. Rather, there are different forms of these faculties for each intellectual domain, such as language, music, or vision. Though seldom taken seriously for most of psychology's history, this idea is highly suggestive. The century following Gall saw repeated oscillations between a belief in the localization of function and skepticism. Early challenges from scholars like Pierre Fleurons, who removed parts of animal brains, were followed by a strong chorus of support in the 1860s when Pierre-Paul Broca demonstrated an indisputable relationship between a specific lesion in the left anterior cortex and aphasia, the breakdown of linguistic capacities. Localization of function, if not phrenology, once more carried the day. Attempts to relate the brain to mental function were not new. The Egyptians had located thought in the heart, while Pythagoras and Plato held the mind to be in the brain. Thinkers from Plato and Aristotle to medieval scholars had been interested in breaking down the range of human intellectual abilities. What the 19th century ushered in were highly specific claims about the profile of mental capacities and empirically based efforts to relate specific brain areas to particular cognitive functions. Efforts to establish psychology as a science began in earnest in the latter half of the 19th century, but because the new discipline was eager to define itself as separate from physiology and neurology, it took a different path. Rather than thinking in terms of specific mental contents like language or music, early psychologists searched for the laws of broad, horizontal mental faculties, abilities like memory, perception, and attention, which were thought to operate blindly across diverse contents. Alongside this search for general laws, an equally energetic field emerged focused on individual differences. The British polymath Sir Francis Galton launched this inquiry, developing statistical methods to rank human beings. Initially, it was believed that intellect could be estimated through tasks of sensory discrimination, but the scientific community gradually concluded that a more accurate assessment required looking at more complex capacities involving language and abstraction. At the beginning of the 20th century, the Frenchman Alfred Binet, with his colleague Théodore Simon, devised the first tests of intelligence to sift out retarded children and place others at their appropriate grade level. The excitement over intelligence testing was even more pronounced and prolonged than the enthusiasm for phrenology had been. This mania for evaluating people for school, the military, or industrial organizations fueled the widespread use of tests. For many years, most psychologists viewed intelligence testing as their discipline's greatest achievement and chief claim to social utility. Today, however, most scholars are convinced that this enthusiasm was excessive. The tests are skewed in favor of individuals and societies with schooling, have predictive power for academic success but little beyond it, and have been at the center of a sustained hullabaloo over heritability that is now largely discredited. Still, one long-standing debate within intelligence testing remains central. On one side are the hedgehogs, influenced by Charles Spearman, who believe in the existence of G, a general overriding factor of intelligence measured by every task on a test. On the other side are the foxes, supporters of L.L. Thurstone, who believe in a small set of relatively independent primary mental faculties, such as verbal comprehension, numerical fluency, and spatial visualization. It is important to stress that neither side has been able to gain an upper hand because the issue is mathematical in nature. Given the same set of data, different methods of statistical analysis can be used to support either the idea of a G factor or the notion of discrete mental abilities. It is a matter of taste or preference, not one on which scientific closure is likely to be reached. It was from an individual trained in the IQ tradition that a radically different view of intellect emerged. The Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget began his career interested in the errors children make on intelligence tests. He came to believe that the important thing was not the accuracy of a child's response, but the line of reasoning invoked, which is best seen by focusing on the assumptions that spawn erroneous conclusions. For example, it is revealing that 4-year-olds think a hammer is more like a nail than a screwdriver because their view of similarity reflects physical co-occurrence rather than membership in a hierarchical category. Piaget's work implicitly critiqued the IQ movement's inadequacies. It is blindly empirical, lacks a theory of process, uses microscopic tasks remote from everyday life, and is heavily biased toward verbal and crystallized knowledge. Intelligence tests also reveal little about an individual's potential for growth. With such considerations in mind, Piaget developed a powerful view of human cognition centered on an individual actively making sense of the world. Initially, a baby understands the world through reflexes and physical actions, arriving at a sensory-motor knowledge. The toddler then develops interiorized actions or mental operations and becomes capable of using symbols like words and gestures. Around age 7 or 8, the child becomes capable of concrete operations, able to reason systematically about objects, number, time, and space. The final stage, formal operations, emerges in early adolescence, when the youth can reason in a completely logical fashion, like a working scientist, by testing hypotheses expressed in propositions. This form of logical rational thought, prized in the West, represents the end state of adult cognition. Piaget's formulation has undeniable strengths. It takes children seriously and engages with the central philosophical categories of intellect. However, its weaknesses have become increasingly clear. It paints a picture of only one sort of development, that of the young scientist, and is less applicable to other cultures or other forms of competence, such as those of an artist or a political leader. Furthermore, empirical research has shown that development is more gradual than Piaget claimed, and that his cognitive operations emerge in a much more piecemeal fashion, a phenomenon he called décalage. His tasks remain fairly remote from everyday thinking and tell us little about creativity. If intelligence testing was the vogue 40 years ago and Piagetian theory the rage 20 years ago, a new form of study, information processing psychology, currently enjoys hegemony. This approach provides a second-by-second microgenetic picture of the mental steps involved in solving a problem, with the ultimate goal of simulating the performance on a computer. It is an advance in its focus on the details of processing, offering a more dynamic view of problem-solving and a suggestive notion of executive functions. Yet it also has weaknesses. It lacks an articulated overarching theory, sometimes posits a single, highly general problem-solving mechanism, and like Piaget's work, focuses almost exclusively on logical mathematical problems. It is studiously non-biological, shows little interest in creativity, and most seriously, seems to lack a procedure for adjudicating among competing models, making it far too easy to spin out simulations that support rival arguments. These approaches, the IQ, the Piagetian, and the information processing, all focus on a certain kind of logical or linguistic problem-solving, ignore biology, fail to grapple with creativity, and are insensitive to the range of roles valued in human society. Consequently, an alternative point of view has emerged that focuses precisely on these neglected areas, the symbol systems approach. This fledgling movement, which is closest to my own work, grows out of a philosophical shift toward the symbolic vehicles of thought: language, mathematics, visual arts, and gesture. The core idea is that much of what is distinctive about human cognition involves the deployment of various symbol systems. The challenge is to compose a developmental portrait for each form of symbolic competence: musical, bodily, spatial, and personal, and to determine empirically what connections exist among them. This pluralistic approach can be reconciled with Piaget's scheme through the work of David Feldman, who proposes a range of cognitive domains. Some domains, like the logical-mathematical one Piaget studied, are universal. Others are restricted to certain cultures, like reading, pockets within a culture, map-making, or are highly idiosyncratic, chess-playing. At the opposite extreme are unique domains, where an innovative scientist or artist is initially the only denizen. This focus on domains assumes a stage-like sequence of mastery for each, but success in one does not correlate with success in another. The phenomenon of the child prodigy illustrates this approach perfectly. Prodigies, who move through a domain with incredible speed, pose a problem for Piaget's theory, but provide support for the notion of discrete symbolic domains, since prodigious behavior appears in fields like math or chess, but rarely in literary skill. The study of prodigies also highlights the crucial contribution of society and culture to development. Researchers working in the symbol systems tradition have various focuses, from the media of transmission to the role of literacy to uncovering the natural kinds of symbol systems by drawing on both developmental and neuropsychological perspectives. Delineating these symbolic domains is a pivotal issue with its own challenges, whether one adopts a logical, cultural, statistical, or neuropsychological approach. Each window has its limitations. Breakdowns from brain damage, for example, provide valuable insight, but one cannot assume that they directly unmask the organization of intact capacities. Given these limitations, I have taken a determinedly Catholic approach, surveying information from a wide range of sources, developmental data, psychometric findings, and descriptions of special populations like idiot savants and prodigies. Every researcher has a bias, and in my own case, I believe the most valuable information is likely to come from a deep knowledge of the nervous system. Findings from the brain, in my view, serve as the court of last resort among competing accounts of cognition. Therefore, before embarking upon a study of different intelligences, it is necessary to survey the relevant highlights of recent work in the biological sciences. Chapter 3: Biological Foundations of Intelligence. A comprehensive science of life must account for the nature and variety of human intellectual competences. Given the spectacular progress in biochemistry, genetics, and neurophysiology, the biological sciences should be able to offer a cogent account of these phenomena. Yet the task of marshalling biology to explain human intelligence has barely begun. The findings from these fields bear with particular force on two central issues: the flexibility of human development and the identity of the intellectual capacities human beings can develop. The first issue concerns the tension between a developmental path that is relatively locked in and one that is malleable or plastic, shaped by interventions at crucial times. The second issue concerns whether humans possess general, all-purpose information processing mechanisms, as the hedgehogs believe, or a proclivity to execute certain specifiable intellectual operations, as is more reminiscent of the fox. Taken together, these questions guide a search for the principles that govern the nature, development, and organization of human intellectual capacities over a lifetime. The preponderance of evidence points toward a view of considerable plasticity, especially in early life, that is nonetheless modulated by strong genetic constraints, and an accumulating body of findings suggests that human beings are predisposed to carry out certain specific intellectual operations. An initial and proper concern for any biological investigation is genetics. Since the genetic code was cracked, it is not surprising that psychologists have looked to DNA and RNA for answers to puzzles about the intellect. In one sense, everything we achieve is coded in our genetic material, and the fundamental distinction between the genotype, our genetic makeup, and the phenotype, its observable expression in an environment, is crucial. However, the lessons from genetics are far from direct. While the field has made great progress in accounting for simple traits, it remains woefully ignorant about the genetic component of complex abilities, like solving equations or creating music. These traits involve many polymorphic genes and are not amenable to laboratory study. Speculations about how certain gene combinations might lead to talents remain just that, speculations. Even the most reliable clues from twin studies yield widely divergent conclusions about heritability. Depending on their assumptions, scientists looking at the same data have estimated the heritability of intelligence, as measured by IQ tests, as high as 80% or as low as 0. While there is little unequivocal evidence, genetics does offer useful concepts. Just as certain individuals are at risk for a disease, it may be useful to consider some as at promise for a talent, possessing a special proclivity for acquiring a skill rapidly, though this promise is by no means a guarantee of development. Another suggestive idea comes from the study of isolated populations that have undergone genetic drift. The unique abilities and traits found in these groups suggest that the full range of human competences may be far broader than what is commonly observed. A prudent research strategy would be to sample widely among diverse human populations to document the varieties of human nature that have in fact been achieved. While genetics proves to be of limited utility, a review of neurobiology promises to bear much richer fruit. Here, findings are much closer to the phenomena of cognition and the mind. A key concept for understanding neural growth is canalization, the tendency of an organic system to follow certain developmental paths rather than others. The nervous system grows in an exquisitely timed and programmed fashion, and it is surprisingly difficult to divert it from its prescribed developmental goals. Yet an equally amazing facet of biological development is its plasticity, or flexibility. An organism shows great recuperative powers, especially early in development. A human infant who loses the dominant cerebral hemisphere, for example, will still learn to speak, whereas an adult who suffers the same injury will be severely impaired. But this plasticity is not unlimited. It cannot be considered apart from the timing of an intervention and the nature of the competence involved. Furthermore, each species is specially prepared to acquire certain kinds of information and counter-prepared to master others. The ease with which humans learn natural language and the difficulty most have with formal logical reasoning suggests that our species is prepared for the former, but not the latter. Research on plasticity in early life has yielded several robust principles. The greatest flexibility exists very early in development, after which there is a progressive blocking out of functions. This process is governed by critical periods, sensitive times during which an organism is most vulnerable to deprivation and most capable of rapid development. The degree of flexibility also differs across brain regions. Later developing areas like the frontal lobes are more malleable than a primary sensory cortex. Normal development, in turn, depends on certain expected experiences. A cat's visual system, for instance, will not develop normally unless it is exposed to patterned light and is able to move actively in a variegated environment. Finally, the effects of early injury may be invisible at first, only becoming manifest later in life when a particular brain region is expected to assume its mature function. Determination and flexibility both exert considerable influence. Canalization ensures that most organisms can carry out species-typical functions, while plasticity allows for adaptation to anomalous environments or injuries. The effects of early experience are not limited to specific functions, but extend to the overall functioning of the brain. Pioneering studies with rats have shown that an enriched environment filled with toys and other rats leads to better performance on behavioral tasks and palpable changes in the brain. The cerebral cortexes of enriched rats weigh more, and the largest increase occurs in the portions of the brain that were particularly stimulated. Subsequent research has confirmed that complex environments lead to larger nerve cells, more synapses, and more dendritic connections. In canaries, the size of two nuclei in the brain doubles during the most productive singing periods and shrinks during the summer molt, illustrating a direct link between the learning of a motor activity and the size of the relevant neural structures. Though scientists have been properly prudent about speculating on similar changes in humans, some early neuroanatomical studies noted that a painter had a very large fourth layer of cells in his visual cortex, and a musician with perfect pitch had an analogously large region in his auditory cortex. But bigger is not always better. One of the most fascinating findings in neurobiology is that development involves a significant pruning of an initial excess of neurons and connections. A period of selective cell death, which may involve anywhere from 15 to 85% of the initial neuronal population, occurs as connections are formed. This early overproduction, or sprouting, constitutes the flexibility of the growth period and provides an adaptive advantage, increasing the chances of survival despite early damage. This process may account for certain U-shaped developmental phenomena, like early walking or swimming reflexes, that disappear and later reemerge in a different form. It is also speculated that the tremendously rapid learning of young children, for example in language acquisition, may reflect an exploitation of the large number of synapses available before pruning. This process provides a functional definition of maturity, that time when excess cells have been eliminated and the flexibility of youth is at an end. The biological bases of learning have been illuminated by studies of species as remote as birds and mollusks. The learning of bird song provides an intriguing model for how organisms master a highly particular skill. A male bird goes through stages of subsong and plastic song, a playful rehearsal where it emits far more notes than it will ever use in its adult prime. It is biologically oriented to favor the songs of its own species, and the production of this complex skill is lateralized to the left portion of its brain. At the cellular level, the work of Eric Kandel with the mollusk Aplysia has shown that elementary aspects of learning, like habituation and sensitization, can be localized to the activity of specific nerve cells. Learning results not from new synaptic connections, but from an alteration in the strength of existing ones, yielding a cellular grammar that underlies various forms of learning. These findings have begun to seal the once unbridgeable gap between behavior and biology. These principles of development and learning operate within a nervous system that is not undifferentiated, but has a highly organized architecture. At a fine-grained, molecular level, the cerebral cortex is organized into columns, or modules, which are vertical to the surface and function as quasi-independent, special-purpose processing units. First established in the visual cortex, where they respond to specific features like the orientation of lines, these columns appear to be a fundamental unit of organization across sensory and even abstract processing areas. At a grosser, molar level, the brain is organized into larger regions and hemispheres with distinct functions. The left hemisphere is dominant for language in most individuals, while the right is dominant for visual spatial functions. This specificity is even more fine-grained. Within the language zones, Broca's area is crucial for grammatical production, while Wernicke's area is crucial for comprehension. This evidence supports an emerging consensus around brain localization, refuting the older holist or equipotentialist views of Carl Lashley. The brain is divided into specific regions, each relatively more important for certain tasks than for others. This has led many thinkers to endorse a modular view of cognition, which posits that the mind consists of a number of special-purpose computational mechanisms, dependent on neural hardwiring. These modules operate autonomously, can be triggered automatically, and may be cognitively impenetrable, meaning their operation is not subject to conscious control. This biologically oriented position aligns with both psychological findings about the power of different symbol systems and neuroscientific findings about the organization of the nervous system, painting a picture of a mind composed of fairly specific and independent mechanisms. The picture of the human nervous system that emerges is one shaped by a genetic plan that proceeds along well-canalized avenues, ensuring the reliable development of species-typical abilities. This system also possesses tremendous early plasticity, with its processes of sprouting and pruning, which aids in resilience and adaptability. This growth is not always an advantage, as newly contrived connections can have pernicious long-term effects. The nervous system contains functional units at both microscopic and macroscopic levels, from the columns of the sensory cortex to the larger regions responsible for language and spatial processing. These units suggest a biological basis for specialized intelligences. While nature cannot give us a complete answer to the identity of these intelligences, building upon the findings from neurobiology provides a powerful hint about their possible natural kinds. It is the burden of this book to bring these biological insights to bear, along with cultural perspectives, to see which families of intellectual competence, examined together, make the most sense. Chapter 4. What is an intelligence? The stage has now been set for an introduction of the intelligences. The review of earlier studies of intelligence and cognition has suggested the existence of a number of different intellectual strengths, or competences, each with its own potential developmental history. Similarly, the review of recent work in neurobiology has suggested the presence of brain areas that correspond, at least roughly, to certain forms of cognition, and a neural organization that is hospitable to the notion of different modes of information processing. At least within the fields of psychology and neurobiology, the zeitgeist appears primed for the identification of several distinct human intellectual competences. But science can never proceed in a completely inductive fashion. We could conduct every conceivable psychological test and experiment or ferret out all the neuroanatomical wiring we desired and still not have identified the human intelligences we seek. The question here is not about the certainty of knowledge, but about how knowledge is attained at all. It is necessary to advance a hypothesis or a theory and then to test it. Only as the theory's strengths and limitations become known will the plausibility of the original postulation become evident. Nor does science ever yield a completely correct and final answer. There is progress and regress, fit and lack of fit, but never the discovery of a single key to a set of interlocking issues. If this is true at the most sophisticated levels of physics and chemistry, it is all the more true in the social and behavioral sciences. And so, it becomes necessary to state, once and for all, that there is not, and there can never be, a single irrefutable and universally accepted list of human intelligences. There will never be a master list of 3, 7, or 300 intelligences endorsed by all investigators. While we might come closer to such a goal by sticking to a single level of analysis or a single objective, a decisive theory of the full range of human intelligence is a search that can never be completed. Why, then, proceed along such a precarious path? Because there is a need for a better classification of human intellectual competences. Because a great deal of recent evidence from scientific research, cross-cultural observation, and educational study needs to be reviewed and organized. And above all, because it seems within our grasp to devise a list of intellectual strengths that will prove useful and enable more effective communication about this curiously seductive entity called the intellect. The synthesis that is sought can never be all things for all people, but it holds the promise of providing some things for many interested parties. Before moving to the competences themselves, two topics must be considered. First, what are the general prerequisites for an intelligence, the desiderata to which a set of intellectual skills must conform to even be considered? Second, what are the actual criteria, or signs, by which a candidate competence can be judged for inclusion in our charmed circle of intelligences? To my mind, a human intellectual competence must entail a set of skills for problem solving, which enables an individual to resolve genuine difficulties and, when appropriate, to create an effective product. It must also entail the potential for finding or creating problems, thereby laying the groundwork for the acquisition of new knowledge. These prerequisites focus on intellectual strengths that are of some importance within a cultural context, recognizing that what is valued can differ markedly across cultures. This is a way of ensuring that an intelligence is genuinely useful and important. This criterion alone may disqualify certain capacities, such as the ability to recognize faces. While this ability appears to be a relatively autonomous neurological capacity with its own developmental history, it is not highly valued by cultures, nor does it present ready opportunities for problem finding. Similarly, acute sensory systems, like a keen sense of taste or smell, have little special value across most cultures. Other abilities, such as the cultural roles of scientist or politician, are of great importance but do not qualify because they can be broken down into collections of particular intellectual competences. From the other direction, many skills perennially tested by psychologists, like the recall of nonsense syllables, fail to qualify because they are the contrivances of an experimenter, not skills valued by a culture. This call for an empirically grounded set of faculties, meeting certain biological and psychological specifications, is an effort to find a firmer foundation than the many a priori schemes that have been proposed throughout history. While the resulting list need not be exhaustive, it must capture a reasonably complete gamut of the kinds of abilities valued by human cultures, accounting for the skills of a shaman and a psychoanalyst as well as those of a yogi and a saint. With these prerequisites established, we can turn to the criteria, or signs, of an intelligence. The use of the word signs signals that this undertaking is provisional. No candidate intelligence is included or excluded based on one or two signs alone. Rather, the effort is to sample widely among the criteria and include those candidates that fare the best. The process is more akin to an artistic judgment than a scientific assessment, a kind of subjective factor analysis, but one in which the grounds for judgment are made public. Here, in unordered fashion, are the 8 signs of an intelligence. The first is potential isolation by brain damage. To the extent that a faculty can be selectively destroyed or spared by a brain lesion, its relative autonomy from other faculties seems likely. This evidence from neuropsychology constitutes the single most instructive line of evidence. Second is the existence of idiot savants, prodigies, and other exceptional individuals. The highly uneven profile of abilities seen in these populations, the precocity of a prodigy in one area or the unique sparing of an ability in an idiot savant, allows an intelligence to be observed in splendid isolation. Third is an identifiable core operation or set of operations. An intelligence must have at its heart one or more basic information processing mechanisms, genetically programmed to be triggered by certain kinds of input, such as sensitivity to pitch relations in music or the ability to imitate movement in bodily intelligence. Fourth is a distinctive developmental history, along with a definable set of expert end-state performances. An intelligence should have an identifiable trajectory through which individuals pass, with disparate levels of expertise from novice to master, and perhaps even its own critical periods and milestones. Fifth is an evolutionary history and evolutionary plausibility. A specific intelligence becomes more plausible if one can locate its evolutionary antecedents, including capacities shared with other organisms. Sixth is support from experimental psychological tasks. The methods of cognitive psychology through studies of interference, transfer, and domain-specific memory can provide convincing support for the claim that particular abilities are or are not manifestations of the same intelligence. Seventh is support from psychometric findings. While the tradition of intelligence testing has its flaws, it is relevant. The credibility of a proposed intelligence is enhanced to the extent that tasks purportedly assessing it correlate highly with one another, and less highly with tasks assessing other intelligences, though the interpretation of such findings is not always straightforward. Finally, the eighth sign is susceptibility to encoding in a symbol system. A primary characteristic of human intelligence is its natural gravitation toward embodiment in a culturally contrived system of meaning, such as language, picturing, or mathematics, which makes a raw computational capacity useful and exploitable. With these criteria set forth, it is important to also delimit what intelligences are not. They are not equivalent to sensory systems. They should be thought of as entities at a certain level of generality, broader than highly specific mechanisms like line detection, but narrower than general capacities like analysis or synthesis. Each intelligence is its own system with its own rules and biological bases, and it is a mistake to try to compare them on all particulars. They are not to be thought of in evaluative terms. They can be used for nefarious purposes as easily as for good ones. And finally, they are best thought of as potentials, as sets of know-how or tacit procedures for doing things, rather than as specific programs of action or propositional knowledge. These remarks and cautionary notes should help to place the following descriptions of specific intelligences in their proper perspective. In a book reviewing a whole spectrum, it is only possible to provide a feeling for each one, to convey something of its core operations, its developmental trajectory, and its neurological organization. A final crucial point must be made before turning to the intelligences themselves. There is a universal human temptation to give credence to a word we have become attached to, and intelligence is such a word. We use it so often that we believe in its existence as a tangible, measurable entity. This risk of reification is grave. These intelligences are fictions, at most useful fictions, for discussing processes and abilities that are continuous with one another. They are defined separately to illuminate scientific issues and to tackle pressing practical problems. It is permissible to lapse into the sin of reifying, so long as we remain aware that they exist not as physically verifiable entities, but as potentially useful scientific constructs. Since it is language that has led us into this morass, it is perhaps fitting to begin the discussion of the particular intelligences by considering the unique powers of the word. Chapter 5: Linguistic Intelligence. In the early 1940s, a correspondence between the young British poet Keith Douglas and the established doyen T.S. Eliot revealed the intricate considerations that lie at the heart of linguistic intelligence. Eliot, in his invariably helpful responses, guided the younger poet through the meticulous process of revision. He warned against ineffective adjectives, criticizing a phrase like impermanent building by noting that the impermanence should have already been established in the poem. He pointed out inconsistencies in imagery, questioning a stanza in which the poet was both a pillar and like a mouse. And of the poem's overall myth, he gently critiqued its logic, observing that one exorcises ghosts from houses, not a substantial lady from a ghostly house. In this, Eliot was simply making public the private struggles familiar to any poet. His own notes on the four quartets document the agony of selecting the perfect word, cycling through phrases like at dawn, lantern out, and the antelucan hour before a friend's suggestion of waning dusk finally satisfied him. This search for the one right word, a process of finely weighing alternatives, is a hallmark of the poet's craft. Robert Graves recounted considering frame of doubt and net of doubt before a trip to the sea inspired the phrase, a close call of doubt. A dictionary confirmed his intuition. Call carried all the senses he needed, a newborn's lucky membrane, a gossamer web, a cap confirming a woman's glory, while providing a pleasing alliteration. Similarly, Stephen Spender built a poem from a simple notebook jotting, "There are some days when the sea lies like a harp stretched flat beneath the cliffs." He labored through at least 20 versions, trying to clarify the scene and realize his inner image of the Earth's brief life. An early attempt, "The waves are wires, burning as with the secret songs of fires," was too direct, too overstated. Another, with the phrase, "visual silent music of the eyes," mixed too many figures of speech. His final version placed the images in a more expansive context. "There are some days the happy ocean lies, like an unfingered harp, below the land. Afternoon gilds all the silent wires into a burning music of the eyes." While perhaps less strikingly original than some earlier attempts, it captured his initial vision with fidelity and clarity. In these struggles, the central aspects of linguistic intelligence are laid bare. The poet must be superlatively sensitive to the shades of meaning in a word, to its penumbras and connotations, which is the domain of semantics. The logic of the poet, as Eliot observed, is as severe as that of the scientist, but it centers on the interaction of these linguistic connotations. This sensitivity must extend to phonology, the sounds and musicality of words. W. H. Auden declared, "I like hanging around words, listening to what they say." And for Graves, close call had to work as sound just as much as it had to work semantically. A mastery of syntax, the rules governing the ordering of words, is another essential element. An intuitive understanding of both how to construct phrases and when it is permissible to flout the rules. Finally, the poet must appreciate the pragmatic functions of language, the many uses to which it can be put, from a lyric of love to the subtleties of a plea. It is this fascination with language itself, a technical facility with words that precedes the desire to express ideas, that most clearly marks the future poet. The poet, then, exemplifies the core operations of language, but these operations are not the poet's alone. A sensitivity to the meaning of words, their order, their sounds and rhythms, and their various functions is a competence possessed in significant degrees by all of us. One could not appreciate poetry, let alone navigate the world, without a considerable command of this linguistic tetrad. Linguistic intelligence is, in fact, the most democratically shared of the competences. The poet seems simply to have developed to a superlatively keen degree capacities that all normal individuals have within their grasp. Beyond the realm of poetry, these capacities find expression in other major uses. There is the rhetorical aspect, the ability to use language to persuade, a skill honed by political leaders but cultivated by every 3-year-old wanting another piece of cake. There is the mnemonic potential of language, its power to help us remember everything from lists to directions. There is its crucial role in explanation, the primary means through which teaching and learning occur. And finally, there is the potential of language to reflect upon itself, to engage in the metalinguistic analysis that has been at the heart of the revolution in linguistics sparked by Noam Chomsky. Because it is so preeminent and thoroughly studied, linguistic intelligence serves as a firm foundation for exploring the nature of human intelligence itself. The roots of spoken language are found in a child's babbling, a universal stage that soon gives way, around the second year, to single words and then to simple, meaningful phrases. Eat cookie, baby cry. By age 3, the child is uttering strings of far greater complexity, and by 4 or 5, has mastered the essentials of adult syntax. At these tender ages, children are already transcending the mundane, creating appealing figures of speech, telling stories, and even engaging in simple metalinguistic banter. This astonishingly rapid and accurate acquisition of language, often from impure samples of speech, has led scholars like Chomsky to argue that children must be born with an innate knowledge of linguistic rules, a language organ that is particularly attuned to the core components of syntax and phonology. While this developmental scheme pertains to all children, vast individual differences exist in the pace and style of mastery. The young Jean-Paul Sartre, for example, was so precocious that by age 5 he could enchant audiences with his fluency and mimicry, and soon after began to find his fullest identity in the clandestine act of writing, filling notebooks he would later forget. By writing a great deal, Sartre was forging the path common to all authors, for practice is the essential condition of eventual success. The writer's skill is a muscle demanding daily exercise. In A Young Writer, Auden argued, promise inheres not in original ideas but in technical skill, a devotion to language like that of a young man courting his beloved. This development begins with imitation of the masters, but true maturity requires finding one's own poetic voice. A process fraught with the pitfalls of immaturity, slavish imitation, rigid adherence to form, or the adolescent error of believing every idea can be expressed in verse. Ultimately, the writer must find the right framework for their words, an intuitive knowledge of form that no textbook can provide. The flowering of linguistic intelligence has its basis in the brain, particularly in the left hemisphere for most right-handed individuals. Difficulties in language learning are often linked to this neural architecture, from problems with auditory discrimination tied to the left temporal lobe to impairments in syntax. Conversely, in many otherwise disturbed children, language is selectively spared. Many children with intellectual disabilities display a surprising ability to master the core phonological and syntactic aspects of language, and in rare cases of hyperlexia, children with autism or other conditions can decode texts at an astonishingly early age, often with little comprehension. The brain's early plasticity allows for remarkable recovery. If the left hemisphere is removed in the first year of life, the right hemisphere will develop language, though with a lasting cost, a reliance on semantic cues at the expense of syntax. The tragic case of Jeannie, a child who learned language only after being deprived of it until puberty, suggests a critical period for this process. Her linguistic processing was mediated by the right hemisphere, and she never mastered syntax. As the brain matures, this flexibility wanes, and localization of function becomes the rule, with specific lesions causing specific and permanent disabilities. The story of language is also one of evolution. Anatomical asymmetries in the brain favoring language can be traced back to Neanderthals, suggesting that the capacity for language has ancient roots. Human linguistic competence likely resulted from the coming together of discrete systems over thousands of years. Pragmatic gestures shared with apes, musical capacities, and the ability to associate a name with an object. The crucial, and uniquely human, development was a supralaryngeal vocal tract capable of the distinct articulation needed for rapid, syllable-sized speech. Across cultures, this intelligence has been put to a variety of uses and has been rewarded in diverse ways. In oral traditions, bards and singers of tales can create thousands of verses of epic poetry, relying on mastered frames and a formidable mnemonic capacity that is often more developed in illiterate individuals. Verbal memory itself has been highly valued, from the 10,000 clan names known by an erudite Iatmul male to the elaborate mnemonic systems of classical times. Language is also the medium for play, from verbal dueling in Mexico to the oratorical contests that, for the Maori, replaced warfare. Throughout history and across societies, from ancient Greece to contemporary Africa, rhetorical power has often been synonymous with political power. While our own culture places a relatively greater emphasis on the written word and on logical mathematical intelligence, the power of spoken language remains potent. Writing, of course, brings its own challenges. demanding that the author supply a context that is self-evident in spoken communication. This leads to a distinction in the use of language. In a poem, the choice of every word is paramount, while in a lengthy novel, the emphasis is more on conveying a collection of ideas and themes, with individual word choice being less at a premium. This highlights the dual nature of language. In some domains, like poetry or a verbal joust, language itself is at the forefront. In others, it is a tool, a means for accomplishing other business. A scientist uses language to communicate ideas that could ultimately be expressed in equations or diagrams. A historian uses it to convey an interpretation of evidence. Even a novelist uses words to wrest the essence of an experience from clumsy life. But once that experience has been conveyed, the actual words become less important than they do in a poem, which is why novels are far more translatable than poetry. While language can be conveyed through gesture and writing, it remains at its core a product of the vocal tract and a message to the human ear. Its integral tie to the auditory-oral tract helps explain its current representation in the brain. Yet, it is not simply an auditory-oral intelligence. The fact that deaf individuals can master rich and complex sign languages is decisive proof that it is not merely a form of auditory intelligence. Furthermore, there is another powerful and autonomous intelligence with an equally long history that is also tied to the auditory-oral tract: musical intelligence. Buried deep in evolution, music and language may have sprung from a common expressive medium, but they have taken separate courses for thousands of years. What they share is an existence not tied to the physical world of objects or to the world of other persons. It is to the nature and operation of this other autonomous competence that we now turn. Chapter 6: Musical Intelligence. Of all the gifts with which individuals may be endowed, none emerges earlier than musical talent. It is a phenomenon as rife with speculation as it is mysterious, and its study may illuminate not only the special flavor of music, but also its relation to other forms of human intellect. A hypothetical audition for 3 preschool children can give a feeling for the range and sources of these early gifts. The first child plays a Bach suite for solo violin with technical accuracy and considerable feeling. The second, after hearing a Mozart aria sung only once, performs it completely. The third sits at the piano and plays a simple minuet of his own composition. 3 prodigies, but have they arrived at this youthful height by the same route? Not necessarily. The first could be a Japanese child from the Suzuki Talent Education Program, who, like thousands of her peers, has mastered a string instrument before starting school. The second could be an autistic child, barely able to communicate, yet exhibiting an isolated sparing of musical intelligence that allows him to sing back any piece he hears. The third could be a young Mozart or Mendelssohn, raised in a musical family and beginning to pick out tunes on his own. These patterns are genuine. Musical precocity can be the result of a superb instructional regime, a life in a music-filled household, or a mysterious feature of a crippling malady. Underlying each may be a core, inherited talent, but other factors are clearly at work, and the milieu will always shape the public expression of that talent. These early performances, however charming, are only the barest beginning. To understand the end state of this intelligence, it is best to start, as with the poet in the previous chapter, by examining those who have achieved unambiguous musical accomplishment: the composers. The American composer Roger Sessions described the state of a composer as constantly having tones in his head, hearing rhythms, melodies, and larger musical patterns near the surface of his consciousness. Composing begins when one of these ideas crystallizes, seizing the composer's attention. This pregnant musical image, be it a simple fragment or something more elaborate, harbors many implications and stimulates a process of logical musical thinking, a consequential working out of a sustained musical impulse. The composer's oral imagination, sure of its direction, governs every choice, elaborating on the original idea through contrast, association, and variation. Other composers echo this sense of naturalness. Aaron Copland felt composing was something he was born to do, like eating or sleeping. Wagner compared it to a cow producing milk. The only mystery, in Copland's view, is the source of the initial idea, which seems to arrive like a gift from heaven. Once it has come, the process of development and elaboration follows with a surprising inevitability, guided by the structural forms and techniques that have evolved over the years. This process, as the composer Harold Shapiro explains, draws upon a vast, unconsciously absorbed repository of tonal memory, which the creative mind metamorphosizes and compounds with remembered emotional experiences. What this process is not, the composers agree, is linguistic. Sessions was adamant that words played no role in the act of composition, which is carried on entirely in the medium of sounds and rhythms. Stravinsky went a step further, insisting that composing is doing, not thinking. This rarefied experience can be connected to our own through the act of listening. As Copland suggests, the intelligent listener, like the composer, must be aware of the musical material, the melodies, rhythms, and harmonies, and follow the principles of musical form. This active listening is a kind of vicarious performance. At the core of musical intelligence are its principal constituent elements: pitch, or melody, and rhythm. To these can be added timbre, the characteristic quality of a tone. The organization of music is both horizontal in the unfolding of pitches over time and vertical in the harmonic effects of simultaneous sounds. While audition is central, it is not the whole story. The rhythmic aspect of music can be experienced by the deaf, and composers like Stravinsky have always stressed the significance of seeing music performed. Closely allied to these elements is the affective core of music. The central puzzle of this intelligence is its profound connection to emotion. While science might prefer to describe music in objective, physical terms, hardly anyone can deny its emotional power. Music does not convey emotions directly, but, as Sessions noted, it can capture their forms. Its movement can be restless and agitated, or it can move slowly in a prevailingly downward direction. This virtual unanimity of testimony suggests an inextricable link between perceptual and emotional factors in the brain. Psychologists have tried to understand musical perception through both bottom-up approaches, studying the building blocks of single tones and simple rhythms, and top-down approaches, examining reactions to global properties of musical works. More recently, a middle ground has emerged, using musical fragments that are both analyzable and genuinely musical. This research reveals that even naive listeners possess schemas for music, an intuitive sense of key, rhythm, and structure that allows them to judge the appropriateness of a musical completion. Like language, music has different levels of organization, from individual tones to larger structures, and its apprehension requires both local analysis and an appreciation of the overall form. The development of this competence begins in infancy, with children singing as well as babbling, able to match the pitch, loudness, and melodic contour of their mother's songs. In the second year of life, they begin to invent spontaneous songs and reproduce characteristic bits of familiar tunes. By the age of 3 or 4, the melodies of the dominant culture have won out, and spontaneous creation wanes. Individual differences in this domain are far more striking than in language. Some children can match long segments of a song by age 2, while others still struggle with melodic contours at age 5. In our culture, where music occupies a relatively low niche, there is little further musical development for most children after the school years begin. In other cultures, however, the trajectory is vastly different. The Anang of Nigeria introduce infants to music and dance within a week of birth, and by age 5, children can sing hundreds of songs and play several instruments. The musician and psychologist Jean Bamberger has analyzed this development in terms of 2 contrasting ways of processing music. The initial approach is figural, an intuitive global know-how that attends to the felt features of a melody. This is later supplemented by a formal mode of thought, a principled know that, which allows one to conceptualize and analyze music in terms of its system and structure. For the young prodigy, who may have advanced far on figural intuition alone, the transition to formal thinking can precipitate a midlife crisis in adolescence. This clash between ways of knowing, combined with the realization of the sacrifices required to pursue a musical career, is a pivotal moment that determines whether a young talent will continue to develop. The development of such talent is a product of both training and innate ability. The Suzuki method in Japan demonstrates that large numbers of children can be trained to play instruments at a very high level. Yet if there is any area where a lavish genetic background pays dividends, it is music. The dramatic story of the pianist Arthur Rubinstein, who came from a non-musical family but displayed an extraordinary and undeniable talent from his toddler years, provides persuasive evidence for a powerful genetic proclivity. Yet even for a prodigy, achievement does not follow automatically. For every 10 prodigies, there are several who fail to reach the heights of musical achievement, undone by issues of motivation, personality, or character. The path from performer to composer often involves a crucial shift in motivation, a discovery of pleasure not just in interpreting a piece, but in decomposing and changing it. As the young Stravinsky found when he discovered intervals he liked better than the ones he was supposed to be playing. The evolutionary origins of music are mysterious, though many scholars suspect it split off from a common origin with language hundreds of thousands of years ago. A powerful parallel exists in the animal kingdom, birdsong. Like human music, birdsong has a prescribed developmental path, from subsong to plastic song to the final species song, and this development is shaped by a mix of innate and environmental factors. Most intriguingly, birdsong is lateralized, in this case to the left part of the avian brain, with lesions there destroying the song. This provides a compelling model for how a core musical competence might be organized in the nervous system. This brings us to the crucial question of musical intelligence's autonomy. The temptations to draw analogies with language are considerable, but experimental support for their separation is strong. Diana Deutsch has shown that memory for pitch is processed by different mechanisms than those used for language. Verbal interference does not affect it. The most dramatic confirmation comes from studies of brain-damaged individuals. One can suffer significant aphasia without any discernible musical impairment, and one can become musically disabled while retaining linguistic competences. The neurological facts are that while language is lateralized almost exclusively to the left hemisphere, the majority of musical capacities, including sensitivity to pitch, are localized in the right hemisphere. The picture is complicated. With musical training, some processing seems to shift to the left hemisphere, but the surprising variety in the neural representation of music does not compromise its autonomy. What is crucial is its dissociation from other faculties. Music seems to be in this regard sui generis, just like language. The autonomy of musical intelligence is further supported by its selective preservation in individuals with autism or savant syndrome, and its precocious appearance in otherwise normal children. This intelligence also has important and integral links to other competences. Its ties to bodily movement are natural and primordial, evident in the way young children cannot sing without moving and in the evolutionary connection to dance. Its links to spatial intelligence are less obvious, but suggested by their shared localization in the right hemisphere and the powerful spatial abilities required to manage the complex architectonics of a composition. Its connection to the personal intelligences lies in its universally acknowledged power to capture and communicate the feeling life of persons, a process that may rely on the subcortical structures of the brain central to emotion. Finally, its long-storied connection to mathematical intelligence, dating back to Pythagoras, is evident in the numerical regularities of rhythm and the mathematical patterns in musical structures. But the core operations are distinct. For the mathematician, music is just another pattern. For the musician, the patterned elements must appear in sound and serve an expressive purpose. It is this fundamental difference in their tasks that underscores music's status as an autonomous, intellectual realm. Chapter 7. Logical Mathematical Intelligence. Piaget was fond of an anecdote about a child, destined to become an accomplished mathematician, who one day confronted a set of objects and decided to count them. He found there were 10. He then counted them again, pointing in a different order, and discovered with growing excitement that there were still 10. Through this playful act, the youngster had arrived at a fundamental insight. The number 10 was not an arbitrary outcome, but referred to the aggregate of elements, no matter how they were ordered. Here, in the simple actions of a child upon the physical objects in his world, lie the roots of the highest regions of logical, mathematical, and scientific thought. In contrast to the linguistic and musical capacities, which find their origins in the auditory oral sphere, logical mathematical intelligence begins with a confrontation with the world of objects. From this starting point, it rapidly becomes remote from the material world, proceeding along a long and complex chain from objects to statements, from actions to the relations among actions, and ultimately from the realm of the sensory motor to the heights of pure abstraction. The most path-breaking research on this developmental journey was conducted by the Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget. In his view, all knowledge derives from one's actions upon the world, and so the study of thought must begin in the nursery. There, the infant explores objects, nipples, rattles, cups, and forms expectations about their behavior. This early knowledge is tied completely to the moment-to-moment experience. When objects disappear from sight, they cease to exist in the child's consciousness. Only after about 18 months does the child attain a sense of object permanence, the crucial cornerstone that objects have an existence apart from one's own actions. Once the permanence of objects is appreciated, the child can think of them in their absence and begin to group them into classes. All the trucks, all the yellow cars. For a few years, this recognition lacks a quantitative aspect. The child can make approximate judgments of more or fewer, but is easily fooled by perceptually seductive cues, concluding that a widely dispersed pile of candies contains more than a denser heap. Even if the child can recite the rote number series, a manifestation of linguistic intelligence, this skill remains detached from his assessment of quantity. Then, pivotal events ensue. The child learns to map the number series onto arrays of objects, coordinating pointing with recitation, and comes to understand that the final number in the count represents the cardinal quantity of the set. By the age of 6 or 7, he has reached the level of Piaget's young mathematician to be able to equate two arrays on the basis of number and possessing a foolproof method for assessing quantity. From this mastery of equivalence, the child can undertake further mental operations, which are at first performed physically upon the material world. He adds or subtracts elements, manipulates candies or marbles, and explores causal relations. After a time, however, these actions become internalized. The child no longer needs to touch the objects, but can make the required comparisons in his head. These mental operations become attended by a sense of logical necessity. Two piles remain the same, not because a recount confirms it, but because you haven't added or taken anything away, and therefore they must remain the same. Because these actions are still restricted to objects that can be potentially manipulated, Piaget termed them concrete operations. The final stage of mental development arrives in early adolescence with the capacity for formal operations. The individual can now operate not just on objects or their mental images, but on symbols, words, numbers, equations that stand for objects and actions. He can state a set of hypotheses and infer their consequences. Where physical actions once transformed objects, mental operations now transform symbols. The same rules of reasoning can be applied to statements treated as objects to be manipulated, quite apart from their common sense meaning, as in the abstract delight of a logical syllogism. Piaget's account of this passage from sensory-motor to concrete to formal operations is the best worked-out trajectory of growth in developmental psychology. His fundamental stages are like giant cognitive waves, spreading across all domains of knowing. My major bone of contention with Piaget has been that he painted a brilliant portrait of development in one domain, logical mathematical thought, but erroneously assumed it pertained to all others. For now, however, this quarrel can be suspended, for we are in the domain where his work is supremely germane. Piaget shrewdly discerned the origins of this intelligence in the child's actions, the importance of the discovery of number, the gradual transition to interiorized actions, and the special nature of higher tiers of development involving hypothetical statements. The realms of number, mathematics, logic, and science are not coextensive, but they do form a family of interrelated competences. As Bertrand Russell observed, logic and mathematics differ as boy and man. Logic is the youth of mathematics, and mathematics is the manhood of logic. Beginning with objects, the individual moves toward increasingly abstract formal systems, where interconnections are a matter of logic rather than empirical observation. The mathematician ends up in a world of invented concepts with no direct parallel in reality, while the logician focuses on the relationship among statements. It is primarily the scientist who retains the direct tie to the world of practice, creating models that must bear a continuing relationship to facts discovered about the world. While the products of language and music are readily available, the work of mathematicians is like a great temple that the uninitiated can view only from the outside. The thought processes involved are illuminated by the introspections of the great mathematician Henri Poincaré. He reasoned that mathematical intelligence is not a matter of sheer memory for the steps in a long chain of syllogisms. Rather, it is an intuition for the order of the reasoning, an appreciation of the nature of the links between propositions that allows the steps to be reconstructed or even reinvented. This ability to invent significant new mathematics is rare. The mathematician, like a poet, is a maker of patterns, but his patterns are made of ideas and are therefore more permanent. The most central feature of this gift is the ability to handle skillfully long chains of reasoning, applying theories derived in simple contexts to very complicated ones, a prosecution that may begin with an intuition but must end in a proof of exacting Apollonian detail. The development of mathematics as a field parallels this individual trajectory toward increasing abstraction, evolving from the idea of number to algebra and then to the more generalized dimension of functions. It is a world apart, and to choose it requires an ascetic passion for abstraction. The isolation can be severe and the concentration painful, but the rewards are of a high order. The exhilaration of breakthrough, the thrill of solving a long insoluble problem, the delight of finding an analogy between kinds of analogies. The tribe of mathematicians is special, and within it, speed and power of abstraction are the ultimate measures of rank. Men like John von Neumann are masters of technical skill and formal notation, while others like Stanislaw Ulam have a knack for feeling the gist of the gist without knowing all the details. At the center of this prowess is the ability to recognize and solve significant problems, a process that can be aided by heuristics, generalize, specialize, work backward, but which at its highest level remains a mystery of discovery. Science and mathematics are closely allied, with nearly every significant mathematical invention eventually proving useful to science. But while the mathematician explores abstract systems for their own sake, the scientist is motivated by a desire to explain physical reality, using mathematics as an indispensable tool. The evolution of science parallels the logical mathematical development of the child, from simple experimentation with objects to the systematic confirmation of statements. Isaac Newton, with his comprehensive survey of physical findings fitted into a coherent pattern, is the exemplar of formal operational thought. His driving passion was not to create a consistent abstract world, but to find the secrets of nature, to see himself as a boy on the seashore finding a prettier shell while the greater ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before me. This desire to explain nature creates a tension between the two fields. The intuitions of the scientist, as exemplified by Niels Bohr's unerring instinct for atomic processes or Albert Einstein's revolutionary thought experiment of riding on a beam of light, are rooted in a faith in the simplicity and beauty of natural laws. This faith, a set of underlying themata, is the core of the scientist's belief system, a mission to explain reality that is akin to a religion. This passion often has its roots in a special feature of childhood. Albert Einstein was 4 or 5 when a magnetic compass filled him with awe, a revelation that challenged his belief in an orderly physical world. The mathematician Stanislaw Ulam recalled a childhood fascination with the intricate patterns in an oriental rug. Blaise Pascal, forbidden by his father to study mathematics, reinvented the first 32 propositions of Euclid on his own. Bertrand Russell discovered Euclid at age 11 and found it as dazzling as first love. Such talent announces itself early, and it is crucial that it be developed quickly, for the best years for productivity in these fields are before the age of 40. In this, the mathematician and physicist are like Peter Pans, whose profound curiosity and abstract faculties seem to die off with age. This intelligence, like the others, can be seen in isolated form. Idiot savants display a prodigious, almost automatic ability to calculate, a single component of logical mathematical ability operating in the absence of the abstract, problem-finding talent of the true mathematician. Conversely, some individuals of otherwise normal ability show selective weakness in this realm, from a numerical difficulty akin to dyslexia to the intriguing developmental Gerstmann syndrome, in which an impairment in learning arithmetic is linked to difficulties with finger recognition and left-right orientation. Neurologically, this intelligence seems to be organized differently from language and music. Its precursors are found in other animals, but in humans its neural representation appears to be more diffuse and less localized. Logical mathematical abilities are more fragile in the face of general deteriorating diseases like dementia than from focal brain damage. Despite this, the existence of specific breakdowns and extreme precocity, along with its positive registration on most of the other signs of an intelligence, justifies its inclusion as an autonomous competence. Across cultures, the concerns of this chapter are not merely parochial. The basic operations of mind, bargaining, classifying, calculating, are universal. The roles of the pure mathematician and the formal scientist may be Western inventions, but sophisticated logical mathematical thought is evident in the complex strategies of the Pella in the game of Kala and in the long chains of reasoning used by Trobriand islanders in land disputes. While Western schooling encourages a particular brand of abstract, decontextualized thought, the fundamental proclivities to order and count are part of a shared human heritage. The pursuits of mathematicians and scientists, while concerned with eternal verities, are themselves subject to profound change over time, a fact poignantly illustrated by the tragic case of Srinivasa Ramanujan, a natural mathematical genius whose isolation in rural India left him out of step with the mathematics of his time. The drift of our own society raises the question of whether this intelligence is somehow more basic than the others. The answer is no. Logical mathematical skill is one among a set of intelligences powerfully equipped for certain problems, but in no sense superior to the others. There is a logic to language and a logic to music, but they operate according to their own rules, and even the strongest dose of mathematical logic will not change their endogenous ways. The frequent attraction of mathematicians to music is not evidence of a fusion of intelligences, but rather an application of the pattern-discerning faculty of the logician to another domain of experience. Perceiving these patterns, whether in music, cricket, or architecture, is an example of the logical mathematical intelligence at work, displaying its own wares. It does not tell us what musical or linguistic intellect is centrally about. Each intelligence has its own ordering mechanisms, reflecting its own principles and preferred media, a fact that underscores the autonomy of this form of thought, even as we acknowledge its powerful and productive interactions with the other intelligences. Chapter 8: Spatial Intelligence. A feeling for the core of spatial intelligence can be gained by attempting the tasks devised by its investigators. A simple task might ask one to choose which of 4 abstract forms is identical to a target. A slightly greater demand is made when one must recognize a form that has been rotated in space. A greater challenge still comes from Roger Shepard and Jacqueline Metzler's research, where one must determine if a 3-dimensional form is a simple rotation of a target or a different form altogether. These problems can also be couched in words, from a simple paper-folding puzzle to a complex linguistic description used to explain Einstein's theory of relativity, all of which call upon the power to create and manipulate a mental image. Central to spatial intelligence are the capacities to perceive the visual world accurately, to perform transformations upon one's initial perceptions, and to recreate aspects of one's visual experience, even in the absence of the relevant physical stimuli. While these abilities are often called visual spatial, the term spatial intelligence is preferable, for just as linguistic intelligence can develop in a deaf individual, spatial intelligence is not inextricably linked to sight and can develop even in a person who is blind. The most elementary operation is perceiving a form, but one enters fully into the spatial realm when asked to manipulate it, to appreciate how it would look from another angle or if it were turned around. Roger Shepard has shown that the time it takes to judge if two complex forms are identical is tied directly to the number of degrees through which one must be mentally rotated to coincide with the other, a finding that is hard to explain without positing some form of spatial intelligence. The ability to solve such problems is a special capacity, and its independence was championed by the pioneering psychometrician L.L. Thurstone, who included it as one of his 7 primary factors of intellect. Spatial intelligence entails a family of loosely related capacities, recognizing instances of the same element, transforming it, conjuring up mental imagery, and producing a graphic likeness of spatial information. These capacities are drawn upon in many arenas, orienting oneself in locales from rooms to oceans, recognizing objects and scenes, and working with graphic depictions like maps and diagrams. More abstractly, this intelligence involves a sensitivity to the tension, balance, and composition in a painting or sculpture, and even a metaphoric ability to discern spatial resemblances across diverse domains. Darwin's tree of life, Freud's unconscious as an iceberg, and other productive images that underlie scientific theories. The psychologist of art, Rudolf Arnheim, has gone so far as to argue that such visual and spatial imagery is the primary source of all productive thought, the other intelligence to be arrayed against the linguistic. The development of this competence, like its logical mathematical cousin, arises from the child's action upon the world. Jean Piaget traced its course from the infant's sensory-motor understanding of space, to the toddler's ability to form static mental images, to the schoolchild's capacity for active manipulation of those images through concrete operations. At this stage, the child can appreciate how a scene would look from another person's vantage point. Finally, in adolescence, the capacity for formal operations allows the youth to deal with abstract spaces and formal rules, relating the world of figural images to propositional statements in geometry and science. While Piaget's account provided the first general picture, the outcome of neuropsychological research on this faculty is even more clear and persuasive. Just as the left hemisphere has been selected for linguistic processing, the posterior portions of the right hemisphere have been selected as the crucial site for spatial processing. Damage to this area can cause difficulties in spatial orientation, imagery production, and memory, and can produce the peculiar phenomenon of neglect, where an individual pays little attention to the left half of space. The psychological reality of this is dramatically illustrated by patients in Milan who, when asked to imagine the famous Duomo Square, could describe objects only in the right half of their mental image. The evolution of spatial intelligence also appears more continuous with processes found in other primates. Keen spatial skill was pivotally important for roving bands of hunters and gatherers, a fact still evident in the extraordinary ability of Eskimos to navigate a featureless terrain by remembering visual configurations. In the non-human world, Wolfgang Kohler's pioneering studies showed that great apes could envision a future state of affairs, mentally integrating the visual spatial properties of 2 sticks to create a tool to solve a problem. Anomalies provide further insight. The study of blind individuals offers decisive proof that spatial knowledge is not totally dependent on vision. A congenitally blind child can infer the metric properties of space, navigate a new route, and even use a tactile map she has never before encountered. There is, it seems, a perceptual system common to both the tactile and visual modalities. Conversely, deficits in spatial perception are characteristic of certain pathologies, like Turner's syndrome. There are also wide individual differences in visual imagery. Some, like the novelist Aldous Huxley, are poor visualizers, while others, like the inventor Nikola Tesla, could project before their eyes a complete picture of a machine in every detail. Most mysteriously, there is the case of Nadia, a severely autistic child who at a very young age could produce drawings of remarkable finesse and accuracy, a flowering of a single intelligence in the face of an otherwise meager array of abilities. Her astonishing drawings stand as an eloquent demonstration of the dissociability of spatial intelligence. A keenly honed spatial intelligence is an invaluable asset, In the sciences, it is readily apparent in Einstein's thought experiments, in the chemist Friedrich Kekulé's dream of a snake biting its tail, which revealed the structure of the benzene ring, and in Watson and Crick's construction of the DNA model. Progress in science has often been yoked to the development of spatial displays, from the renowned sketches of Leonardo da Vinci to the computer models of today. If one had to choose a single area to illustrate its centrality, chess would be a strong candidate. Contrary to the whimsical remark of the former world champion José Raúl Capablanca, chess requires a great deal of intelligence. The blindfolded chess master does not rely on rote recall, but on a special kind of abstract, geometrical memory for patterns and lines of reasoning. As Adrian de Groot's research has shown, a master's fabled memory is not for random configurations, but for meaningful positions, a store of perhaps 50,000 patterns that allows for a meaningful encoding of the board. This ability to relate a perceived pattern to past patterns and to envelop it in an overall game plan is the true sign of talent at chess, a feat that likely draws on a union of both spatial and logical mathematical intelligences. In the visual spatial arts, its centrality is self-evident. The shop talk of artists is filled with the struggle to capture the qualities of the perceptual world, the depth of color in an autumn wood for Van Gogh, the laws of perspective for Dürer, the tenacious visual memory of a strange head for Leonardo. But artistic achievement is not mere duplication. It is also about a sensitivity to composition, to the plastic rhythms that Picasso spoke of. A definite logic in the pursuit of the arts that is concerned with the production of forms whose interactions hold significant meaning. This skill is also the domain of the connoisseur, the art historian Kenneth Clark, who possessed from childhood a freak aptitude for the pure aesthetic sensation, a feeling for the sense of form that is the most inexplicable of all attributes in a work of art. From a cultural perspective, this intelligence is found everywhere. The ability to notice fine details is at an apogee among the Gikwe Bushmen of the Kalahari. A keen visual memory is prized among the Kikuyu in Kenya, and the high degree of spatial acuity among the Eskimos is legendary. Perhaps most astounding is the navigational skill of the Puluwat people of the Caroline Islands, who guide canoes safely between islands by integrating a vast and abstract mental system of stars, waves, reefs, and the sun. It is a striking paradox that while performance on routine tests of spatial thinking often falls off with age, individuals in whom these abilities are prized, artists like Picasso and Titian, who painted into their 90s, often perform very well until the end of their lives. Unlike logical mathematical intelligence, which concludes its trajectory in increasing abstraction, spatial intelligence remains tied fundamentally to the concrete world of objects and their location, which may account for its staying power. It is the second form of object-based intelligence we have encountered, and it sets the stage for a third, a form that remains even closer to the individual, for it inheres in the use of one's body and one's actions upon the world. Chapter 9. Bodily Kinesthetic Intelligence. Our hero, Bip, hauls his suitcase onto the platform, climbs aboard the train, and with considerable strain, shoves it onto the overhead rack. As the train gathers speed, he is tossed about in his seat and the precariously placed suitcase is thrown from the rack. Bip catches it, carefully replaces it, and then begins to search for his ticket. He goes through his pockets, turning them inside out with increasing frustration as the train continues to sway. The search becomes frantic. He rummages through his entire suitcase. Later, he takes lunch from the case, unscrews the cap of his thermos, and lifts the cork to pour coffee into the cup that had served as the cap. But with the lurching of the train, the coffee misses its mark, flowing in a straight line to where the cup was but no longer is. Eventually, the hapless Bip falls asleep, only to be rudely awakened when the train jolts to an abrupt halt. This little scene is not an observation from a real train, but a mime performance by the great French artist Marcel Marceau. In it, we see in particularly striking form the actions and capacities associated with a highly evolved bodily kinesthetic intelligence. On the surface, the mime is merely doing what real individuals do all the time, but the representation of these events in the absence of physical props is a considerable departure from daily activity. The mime must create the appearance of an object, person, or action through artful caricature, an exaggeration of movement and reaction that allows the components to be stitched together into a seamless performance. In this, Marceau displays the core characteristics of this intelligence: the ability to use one's body in highly differentiated and skilled ways for expressive and goal-directed purposes, and the capacity to work skillfully with objects, involving both fine and gross motor movements. While these two capacities can exist separately, they typically go hand in hand. Skilled use of the body has been important for thousands, if not millions of years, reaching an apogee in the West with the classical Greeks, who revered the beauty of the human form and sought a harmony between mind and body. This is a stark contrast to the radical disjunction between the mental and the physical in our own recent cultural tradition, a legacy of Cartesian thought that often privileges abstract reasoning over the activities of the body. This distinction, however, is not universal. The novelist Norman Mailer has described prizefighting as a language of the body, a rapid debate between two sets of intelligences. In recent years, psychologists have also stressed the close link between the use of the body and other cognitive powers. Sir Frederick Bartlett's analysis of skilled performance, in a ball game, at a workbench, or in a surgical operation, revealed a continuous flow from environmental signals to actions, all guided by a well-honed sense of timing, direction, and purpose. Much of what we call thinking, Bartlett argued, partakes of the same principles found in overtly physical skill. The brain's role in this intelligence is profoundly complex. Nearly every segment of the nervous system participates in the execution of motor actions. Voluntary movements require a perpetual comparison between intended actions and their actual effects, a continuous feedback loop that allows for refinement and regulation. In the absence of such feedback, perception itself cannot develop normally. Some highly skilled, overlearned activities, however, proceed at such a rapid clip that feedback cannot be used. These movements, found in the pianist or the athlete, are pre-programmed in the brain, unfolding as a seamless unit. Uniquely in humans, this motor activity is governed by the principle of dominance, a proclivity for the left hemisphere of the brain to assume ascendancy, a tendency that is likely linked to language. Injuries to these dominant zones in the left hemisphere can produce selective impairments known as the apraxias, where an individual who is physically and cognitively capable is nonetheless unable to carry out a sequence of motor actions in the proper manner. This can be as specific as an inability to get dressed, or as general as a clumsy execution of any command. The existence of these disorders, often in the absence of any linguistic impairment, provides strong evidence for bodily intelligence as a realm discrete from logical and linguistic forms of intellect. The intelligence of the body can also be spared in isolated form. Patients with devastated linguistic and logical capacities can retain highly skilled motor abilities, and exceptional youngsters, like idiot savants or autistic children, often show a preserved interest and skill in bodily activities and mechanical devices. The most famous case may be that of Joey, the mechanical boy, an autistic youth who not only had a special interest in taking machines apart and putting them together, but who also, in a pathetic and skillful pantomime, pretended that he was a machine, connecting himself with imaginary wires to a source of electrical energy before he could eat. This intelligence has a long evolutionary history. Flexible tool use is not found in animals below the primate order. Higher primates, however, have been using simple tools for millions of years, and chimpanzees have developed sophisticated skills like termite fishing, a complex sequence of finding a tunnel, selecting and modifying a probe, and carefully extracting the termites. This skill is not innate, but is learned through a long process of observation and trial and error, a kind of cultural transmission of technique. This progression from simple object manipulation to sophisticated tool use over the course of primate and hominid evolution finds a parallel in the development of the human child, from the simple reflexes of the sensor-motor period to the building of ever more complex structures. The acquisition of symbolic competence, however, forges a major chasm between the bodily intelligence of humans and that of other animals. Once a goal can be stated in words, the very methods of skill acquisition are forever altered. The most sublime and variably deployed use of the body is the dance. Defined as culturally patterned, intentionally rhythmic sequences of nonverbal body movements with aesthetic value, dance goes back to Paleolithic times. It can serve as a vehicle for religious expression, a social diversion, an educational tool, or a psychological outlet. Among the Hopi, it is a duty, a means of maintaining tribal unity and placating the gods. In Polynesia, it is personalized and open to improvisation, a realm where individualism is tolerated and encouraged. At its core, the dancer is concerned with placement, timing, and the quality of movement, the elements that constitute a dance vocabulary. But as Isadora Duncan famously remarked, "If I could tell you what it is, I would not have danced it." The logic of dance, as Martha Graham observed, occurs on the level of motor activity. Other performing roles, like that of the actor, also draw heavily on bodily intelligence. The ability to observe carefully and recreate scenes in detail, a mimetic ability that begins in the first weeks of life, is at a premium. This is supplemented by a special memory for feelings, an ability to use the subconscious to recreate emotion on cue, as taught by Konstantin Stanislavski. For many, this capacity for inner mimicry, for involuntarily going through the experiences and feelings of others, is what allows us to understand and participate in all art forms. The athlete, too, excels in the intelligence of the body, in grace, power, speed, and accuracy. This skill is a combination of bodily endowment, a well-developed kinesthetic sense of timing, and a craft that may draw on other intelligences to plot strategy and recognize patterns. The inventor, as well, relies on a fusion of bodily intelligence with spatial and logical mathematical capacities, often beginning with a childhood fascination with manipulating and taking apart mechanical objects. In many cultures, the whole area of bodily expression and knowledge assumes a great importance that has been lost in the modern West. Among the Igbo and Anang of Nigeria, demanding bodily skills are a part of daily life, and everyone is expected to be able to dance, sing, carve, and weave. In Bali, where individuals learn virtually nothing from verbal instruction, a well-developed kinesthetic awareness is cultivated from birth. With teachers conveying gestures directly through pressure, a learning that can only happen if one is completely relaxed. This concern with grace and fine motor control is found also in India, in the Japanese tea ceremony, and most fully in Zen Buddhist enclaves, where the master's belief that he can translate intention directly into action defies the canons of modern science. In all of this, the focus has been on the body as an object used by dancers and athletes, or parts of the body used by inventors and workers to manipulate other objects in the world. In this sense, bodily intelligence completes a trio of object-related intelligences, alongside the logical-mathematical, which grows from the patterning of objects, and the spatial, which focuses on transforming objects and navigating among them. But the body is more than another machine. It is also the vessel of the individual's sense of self, the entity to which others respond because of its uniquely human qualities. It is the site of our most awesome accomplishments and our most terrifying tendencies. It is to this Janus-headed variety of intelligence, partly mired in the inner emotional sphere, partly peering outward to the circle of other people, that we must now shift our gaze. Chapter 10. The Personal Intelligences. In 1909, in what the historian H. Stuart Hughes called the most dramatic moment in the intellectual history of our time, an elderly and ill William James made the day-long journey from Cambridge to Worcester, Massachusetts. He went to hear a set of lectures by a younger scholar from Austria, Sigmund Freud. After the lecture, James, the dean of American psychology, approached Freud and said simply, "The future of psychology belongs to your work." It was a meeting of two different worlds. Freud, the pessimistic European intellectual, focused on the individual psyche, its anxieties, its defenses, and its struggle for self-knowledge in the face of the inevitable pains of existence. And James, the American thinker, more open to the possibilities of growth, who stressed the importance of relationships with others, and famously commented, "A man has as many social selves as there are individuals who recognize him." Yet for all their differences, what united Freud and James and set them apart from the mainstream psychology of their time was a profound belief in the centrality of the individual self. They were both sympathetic to the idea of personal intelligences. Freud, the clinician, was preoccupied with an individual's own knowledge of himself, an inward-turning intelligence that would come to be called intrapersonal. James, and the social psychologists who followed him, were more interested in the individual's relationship to the outside community, an outward-turning intelligence that can be termed interpersonal. The core of intrapersonal intelligence is access to one's own feeling life, the capacity to discriminate among one's range of emotions, to label them, and to draw upon them as a means of understanding and guiding one's behavior. In its most advanced form, it is the intelligence of the novelist like Proust, writing introspectively about feelings, or of the wise elder, drawing upon a wealth of inner experience to advise his community. The core of interpersonal intelligence, by contrast, is the ability to notice and make distinctions among other individuals, their moods, temperaments, motivations, and intentions. In its advanced form, it allows a skilled adult to read the hidden desires of others and to act upon this knowledge, a capacity seen in great political or religious leaders like Mahatma Gandhi, in skilled parents and teachers, and in those in the helping professions. These personal intelligences, however, are different from the others. Their raw materials are quickly marshaled by the symbol systems and interpretive means of a culture, making their expression far more distinctive and less comparable across societies. For this reason, and because of their intimate intermingling in the course of development, they are best treated together. They also pass muster according to the criteria for an intelligence. They have identifiable cores, developmental patterns, and neurological representations. Their most important manifestation is the emerging sense of self, an amalgam that arises from the fusion of one's intrapersonal and interpersonal knowledge, a balance struck by every individual and every culture between the promptings of inner feelings and the pressures of other persons. The development of these intelligences begins with the indispensable attachment between an infant and its mother, the potent tie in which the origins of personal knowledge are found. Within the first year, from the universal gamut of feelings and their expression, the infant begins to make the discriminations that introduce it to the realm of intrapersonal knowledge. At the same time, it forms preliminary distinctions among other individuals, pre-tuned to their feelings and behaviors to an extraordinary degree. By the second year of life, a crucial milestone is reached. Thanks to a clever experiment with a daub of rouge on the nose, we know that this is when a child first comes to recognize the image in the mirror as its own, a dawning awareness of a separate physical self. The years from 2 to 5 are a period of major intellectual revolution, as the child becomes a symbolizing creature. The advent of words like me and my, you and him allows for a far richer and more elaborated set of personal discriminations, guided by the interpretive system of the society. Through pretend play, the child tries on the roles of mother, doctor, and policeman, coming to know not only the behaviors of others, but also how it feels to occupy their niches. Theoretical accounts of this period follow the two lines of personal intelligence. The Freudian and Piagetian views see the child as an isolated individual, battling for autonomy and locked in an egocentric worldview. The symbolic interactionist school of Mead and Vygotsky, in contrast, sees the child as an inherently social creature who can come to know himself only through coming to know others. These are not competing views so much as different aspects of a single process. The dawning insights into one's own separate feelings constitute the core of intrapersonal knowledge, but these insights cannot develop in a vacuum, for it is the community that provides the interpretive schemes for these affects. By the start of school, the differentiation between self and others is well consolidated. The child becomes a genuinely social creature, forging friendships, pursuing justice to a fault, and seeking to be a representative member of his community. His definition of self is no longer mired in physical attributes, but is now focused on the things he can do, on the acquisition of competence and industry. In middle childhood, these trends continue toward a keener sense of others, motivations, and a fuller sense of one's own competences. Friendships become deeper, and a great deal of energy is devoted to thinking about the interpersonal realm, leading to intriguing recursive forms of knowledge. He thinks that I think that he thinks. With adolescence, this knowledge takes an important turn. Individuals become more psychologically attuned, more sensitive to the hidden desires and fears of others. Relationships are now based on psychological support, not physical rewards. At the same time, an even more crucial event is taking place. The two forms of personal knowledge must be brought together into a more organized sense of identity, a sense of self. A mature sense of self can take different forms. One view highlights a relatively autonomous self, highly developed and differentiated, as in a Socrates or a Gandhi. Another, more prominent in sociology, sees the person as a collection of diverse masks, called into service as the situation demands, with the accent falling heavily on interpersonal know-how. This latter view finds support in other cultures that explicitly reject the Western ideal of an autonomous self as inimical to the community. The development of this knowledge is a relatively natural process, but it can also be the subject of explicit instruction, from the tutelage of literature and ritual to the modern recourse to therapy and self-help books. The education of these discriminations is a cognitive process. To feel paranoid or jubilant is to construe a situation in a certain way. The biological bases of this personhood have deep evolutionary roots. The prolonged childhood of primates, with the close mother-infant bond, and the emergence of a hunting culture, which demanded group cohesion and cooperation, may be the two key factors that spawned our species' remarkable focus on the person. In our primate brethren, we can see intimations of these intelligences, from a chimpanzee's ability to recognize itself in a mirror to the complex social calculations required to hold a primate society together. Neurologically, all indices point to the frontal lobes as the structures of greatest importance. As the neuroanatomist Wale Nada has shown, the frontal lobes are the meeting place for information from the sensory regions of the brain and from the limbic system, where emotional and motivational states are generated. It is this strategic location that allows them to serve as the major integrating station for our inner and outer worlds. Damage to the frontal lobes can wreak severe damage on personality, erasing an individual's sense of purpose and motivation, leaving them no longer recognizable as the same person. The tragic story of the autistic child, with her inability to communicate and her impaired sense of self, and the contrasting picture of patients with right hemisphere damage, whose language is intact but whose ties to others become superficial and whose sense of self is lost, further underscores the biological reality of these intelligences. The personal intelligences may be rooted in biology, but their constitutions are profoundly shaped by culture. The anthropologist Clifford Geertz's sketch of three contrasting concepts of the person reveals the variety of ways a balance can be struck. In Java, there is a persistent concern with the self, which is seen as a negotiation between two distinct realms, an inside world of subjective feeling and an outside world of external action. In Bali, what is philosophical in Java becomes theatrical. In this Hindu culture, the self is a role, a mask worn in the continuing drama of life, and the great fear is of the raw personality asserting itself and breaking the stylized performance. And among the Moroccans of Sefro, a variegated assemblage of humanity, a symbolic means of identification called the nisba, is used to create a framework for public interaction, while the private person and its more personal forms of life are carefully segregated and savored in private. These examples reveal a fundamental distinction between what can be called particle societies, like our own, where the locus of the self inheres in the isolated individual, and field societies, where the surrounding context is the determining force in life. While the Western notion of the solitary hero symbolizes a particle existence, for individuals in a field society, one's self is other people. Each culture, by its own historical and ecological path, engenders a person, a sense of self, an idiosyncratic but adaptive amalgam of the intrapersonal and interpersonal. In the end, the glorification of the self is a cultural option, not a human imperative. The personal intelligences are in some ways as basic and biological as any of the others, but the diverse forms they can assume are among their most outstanding features. This Janus-headed variety of intelligence, partly mired in the inner emotional sphere, partly peering outward to the circle of other people, completes our survey of the family of 7 intelligences and sets the stage for a broader reflection on the theory as a whole. Chapter 11. A critique of the theory of multiple intelligences. Having put forth a novel theory of intelligences, designed as a positive model of the different intellectual strengths displayed by human beings, it is now time to examine this theory with a more critical eye. It is important to consider how the theory stacks up against other theories of human cognition, what it accomplishes and what it omits, and how it could be made more useful to practitioners and policymakers. In its strong form, the theory of multiple intelligences posits a small set of human intellectual potentials, perhaps 7 in number, that all individuals are capable of developing by virtue of their membership in the human species. Owing to a constant interaction of heredity and early training, some will develop certain intelligences far more than others, but every normal individual should be able to develop each to some extent. In the normal course of events, these intelligences interact with and build upon one another, and are eventually mobilized in the service of diverse social roles. Nonetheless, at the core of each intelligence there exists a unique computational capacity, an information processing device sensitive to a particular kind of informational content upon which the more complex embodiments of that intelligence are based. This metaphor of a computational device should not be taken too literally. It is not meant to suggest that the brain works like a computer, but rather that the normal human being is constituted with mechanisms that are triggered by specific forms of information. It is best to think of these intellectual competences as a set of natural kinds of building blocks, basic constituents that can enter into compounds and yield a plethora of products. While initially raw and unmediated, they have the potential to be involved in symbol systems and enculturated through cultural tasks. We can see them operating in isolation in unusual populations, but in normal human intercourse, one encounters a seamless functioning of complexes of intelligences. The idea of multiple intelligences is an old one, with faculty psychology having reached its heyday in the 19th century before being almost completely discredited. Recently, however, this modular view has experienced a sort of comeback, a renaissance engendered by the notable lack of success of the search for general, all-encompassing psychological laws. Traces of this older, uniformist approach are still discernible in schools of cognitive psychology that rely on the model of a general-purpose serial computer, with its faith in general problem-solving skills, a central processor, and a single executive. But sharing a misgiving with the present theory, a number of theorists have questioned this model. The British psychologist D. Alan Allport has proposed that the mind is best thought of as a large number of independent, content-dependent production systems operating in parallel, a view for which he finds the firmest foundation in evidence from brain damage. The philosopher Jerry Fodor has also eloquently defended the modularity of mind, arguing for vertical modules like language or music, each with its own mode of operation. But Fodor deviates from a pure modular perspective by positing a central, unencapsulated region of mind concerned with the fixing of beliefs, a processor that has access to the information from the different modules and can draw on it flexibly to make decisions. Whether such a central processor is necessary is a complex and unresolved question. For my part, it is preferable as a research ploy to determine the extent to which all human activities can be explained by the development and interaction of the several individual intelligences. While the fact that similar points of view are in the air is encouraging, it makes it all the more important to justify the particular moves of this theory. The choice of the term intelligence itself is a deliberate one, an attempt to replace the current, largely discredited notion of a single inherited trait with a more viable model. What is crucial is not the label but the conception, that individuals have a number of domains of potential intellectual competence that they are in a position to develop. The analysis extends to perception and appreciation, as well as to production, and to diverse forms of art, science, and sense-making. It is important to acknowledge, however, that there are numerous areas of human psychology, social psychology, the study of affect, the development of character, that this theory cannot encompass. It is not designed to supplant these proper subjects of inquiry, but to cut across them, to underscore the pervasiveness of intellectual activity in realms where it has often been excluded, from interacting with others to enjoying a work of art. The perennial concerns of motivation and attention also escape treatment, though any successful training of the intelligences would depend upon them. More volatile issues arise with higher-level cognitive operations like common sense, originality, and metaphoric capacity, which seem to elude the analytic framework. Common sense, the ability to deal with problems in an intuitive and rapid manner, is customarily invoked in reference to those skillful in the interpersonal or mechanical realms, suggesting it is cognate to the practical application of a small minority of intelligences. Originality, or novelty, is a capacity that also seems to occur principally within single domains. Genuinely original activities can only come about after an individual has achieved mastery in a field, and the seeds of this originality may lie in a basic temperament or personality, as suggested by the early experimentation of future composers like Igor Stravinsky. Metaphorical capacity, the ability to perceive analogies and forge illuminating connections across domains, seems at odds with the whole notion of separate intelligences. MI theory can approach this in several ways. It may be a hallmark of logical mathematical intelligence to perceive patterns. It may be a capacity that exists within particular domains, or it may be a more general, universal phenomenon, as suggested by the cross-modal connections made by infants and the playful metaphorizing of preschoolers. My own fallback position is that skilled metaphorizers have developed this ability in one or more domains and now feel secure enough to apply it elsewhere, though it will always retain a favored home intelligence. A yet more general capacity, wisdom, is what one expects from an older individual with a wide range of critical experiences. My hunch is that this is some combination of common sense, originality, and a seasoned metaphorizing capacity. All of these reductive moves are perhaps permissible if one wants to salvage the theory, but they are not necessary. The fact that the theory of multiple intelligences cannot explain everything does not invalidate it. This brings us back to the sense of self, the cognitive capacity that has placed the greatest strain on the theory. Is it a second-order ability that presides over the others? While some cultures minimize a focus on the self, ours places a great emphasis on it, posing a threat to any view of the intelligences as a simple conversation among equals. My own favored approach is to see the sense of self as an emergent capacity, one that grows out of the personal intelligences but has the option, in certain social settings, of exploiting the other intelligences to devise a special kind of explanatory model of who one is. This fictional entity of the mind, couched in the symbols of language or art, is a model that one can operate upon, just as one operates on a model of the solar system. It just feels different and more important. Of course, the theory must be falsifiable. It could be disproved if its core claims are revised out of existence, if the most significant human activities are better explained by a competing theory, or if the kinds of evidence upon which it is based are found to be fundamentally flawed. Being so discarded would give me little pleasure, but far less than putting forth a theory that was immune to refutation. Even if the list of intelligences can be salvaged, they cannot be viewed merely as raw computational capacities. The world is enwrapped in meanings, and the intelligences can only be implemented by partaking in those meanings. The dumb capacities at the center of intelligence must be made smarter if one is to interact successfully with society. Human intelligences are characterized by their potential for involvement in all manner of symbolic activity. The development of these symbolizing capacities and one's immersion in the Weltanschauung of a culture is the next essential part of the story, a necessary bridge from the raw intelligences to educational practice. Chapter 12. The Socialization of Human Intelligences Through Symbols. The findings from biology and anthropology stand at opposite extremes in any theory of human cognition. From the study of the nervous system, we can ultimately specify the limits on human cognitive activity. From the study of all known cultures, we can gain the fullest possible notion of the range of human abilities. Together, they should provide a composite picture of our intellectual prowess. Yet from the perspective of synthesis, these two domains are too remote from one another. Biology furnishes a picture of genetic potential, of cells and synaptic connections. Anthropology ferrets out the roles, functions, and problems that exist in various societies. There is no ready way to build a bridge directly between them. Their vocabularies and frames of reference are as incommensurate as the structure of a harpsichord and the sound of Bach's music. It is here that the domain of symbols, symbolic products, and symbolic systems enters. This realm is ideally suited to span the gap. The nervous system, while knowing nothing of culture, is constituted to apprehend and deal with symbolic entities like words, pictures, and stories. The culture, while knowing nothing of brain cells, is well equipped to evaluate the dances, dramas, and theories that its members fashion. The realm of the symbol provides the essential tertium quid, the indispensable level of analysis between the constraints of biology and the range of culture. Symbols pave the royal route from raw intelligences to finished cultures. A symbol, in this Catholic view, is any entity that can denote or refer to another, from a word or a number to a line or a rock, so long as it is used to represent some kind of information. Crucially, symbols also convey mood, feeling, or tone, an expressive function that covers the full range of artistic forms. While symbols can function alone, they most commonly enter into highly elaborated symbol systems, like language or mathematics. Mastering the reading and writing of these systems is a major task for every growing child. Finally, these systems gain their greatest utility in the fashioning of full-fledged symbolic products, stories and sonnets, proofs and rituals, which are their ultimate raison d'être. The story of how human beings become accomplished in this symbolic realm can be told in 4 distinct phases. Development begins in infancy, when the newborn's circumscribed set of schemas like sucking and looking gradually acquire meaning. Basic understandings emerge, that people have roles, that events have consequences, that objects fall into categories, and within each of the separate intellectual domains, the infant makes considerable progress. Just as importantly, the intelligences begin to interact. Smooth reaching requires the intercalation of spatial and bodily abilities. A feeling of anxiety when a mother leaves involves the connection of intrapersonal and interpersonal forms. By the end of the first year, the first forms of proto-symbolic behavior appear. The child can appreciate the meaning of a single word or read a pictorial depiction. This is the baptism into the world of public meanings. The years from 2 to 5 are a period of epoch-making symbolic development. The child acquires a first draft knowledge of a whole range of symbol systems: language, pictures, clay and blocks, dance, music, and drama. An example of block play illustrates this progression. The 1-year-old simply mouths or bangs a block. Soon he can relate the block to a picture of one. Around age 2, in an act of pretend play, he can pick up 2 blocks, announce one is the mommy and the other is the baby, and have them take a walk. At 3, he can stack them and declare, "This is a snowman." At 4, he can use them in a numerically precise way, building a staircase with an exact number of blocks. And by 5 or 6, he can exploit the squiggles on the blocks to compose simple words or confirm simple number facts. Within this period, 2 parallel aspects of development are at work. The first is what can be called streams of symbolization, a progression unique to each symbolic system. In language, there is a lengthy evolution of syntactic capacities. In music, a working out of pitch relations. In block play, an understanding of contour and continuity. This is the articulation of a particular raw intelligence as it becomes marshaled by a cultural symbol system, the two increasingly intermeshing. Running concurrently with these encapsulated streams are the sprawling waves of symbolization, psychological processes that typically begin in one symbolic realm, but by their nature spread rapidly into others. The first wave, around age 2, is event structuring, the ability to represent an agent performing an action. It finds its proper loci in language and pretend play, but it spills over, transforming a marker into a truck making vroom sounds instead of a drawing tool. A year later, a second wave of analogical mapping comes to the fore, as the child's symbols begin to capture relationships in the referent. A drawing of a person has appendages. A song captures the up or down contour of a melody. Around age 4, a third wave, digital mapping, appears. The child is now intent on getting quantities exactly right, a beneficent advance that can nonetheless come at the cost of capturing the mood or nuance of an experience. These waves demonstrate a crucial aspect of human intelligence, its flexibility. Unlike the rigidly encapsulated competences of most animals, humans have a proclivity to deploy a new ability widely to see if it flies. After negotiating these streams and waves, the 5-year-old has attained a first-draft knowledge of numerous symbolic products. This age is often a flowering of symbolic activity, as the child produces charming, creative, and original works, freely expressing himself without undue critical apprehension. But a new ensemble of symbolic processes is also beginning to emerge: notational symbolization. This is a second-order capacity to use systems that refer to other symbol systems. Writing refers to speech. Musical notation refers to sound. These notations are not endogenous, but are channels of symbolization furnished by the culture. With their appearance, the hand of the culture can be seen with crystalline clarity, and the formal process of education begins. Now the child is bent upon mastering these new systems in a prescribed way, and in a sense, the fun is over. He becomes a literal-minded student of his culture's symbolic channels, often at the cost of the freer, more idiosyncratic works of earlier years. This literal stage may be an essential aspect of development, a necessary mastery of the system before it can be used for fresh creation. It is a stage that most adults are content never to move beyond. Only a few individuals in most cultures reach the apogee of symbolic competence and then move off in unanticipated directions, fashioning innovative symbolic products or even devising new systems. From infancy to adulthood, the raw intelligences are increasingly exploited and absorbed in the devising of symbolic products. During the preschool years, they proceed along confined streams even as they overrun their boundaries in broad waves. With the advent of notational symbolization, the culture itself intrudes, and the dynamic of an intelligence becomes intermeshed with the cultural agenda. This entire process seems to be part of the human condition. We are as prepared to engage in symbolic processes as squirrels are to berry nuts. This developmental story, however, is not without its controversies. There is a tension between the view that learning becomes increasingly rigidified with age and the alternative view that the mature individual gains conscious access to his modular abilities and can mobilize them for diverse and flexible ends. There is the issue of stages, where the strong Piagetian model of a single, universal sequence has given way to a more plausible view of stage-like sequences existing within each separate domain of intelligence. And there is the classical dilemma of heredity versus environment. While inborn differences are real and can never be completely erased, what recent research has shown incontrovertibly is that early intervention and consistent training can play a decisive role in an individual's ultimate level of performance. This brings us to a conceptual Rubicon. In a sense, the description of individual intelligences has been a fiction, useful for scientific purposes. In the real world, societies are not interested in pure competences, but in amalgams of intellectual and symbolic abilities working toward the smooth accomplishment of valued goals. There is no one-to-one correspondence between an intelligence and a social role. An intellectual strength opens possibilities. A combination of strengths spawns a multiplicity of possibilities. A valued cultural role, like that of a lawyer, can be filled by individuals with different intellectual profiles, one with outstanding linguistic skills, another with highly developed interpersonal skills, a third with powerful logical abilities. It is tempting to engage in the cocktail party exercise of analyzing social roles in terms of their preferred blend of intellectual flavors. The serious point is the dialectic between the roles a culture values and the intellectual skills of its inhabitants. It is through an understanding of how individuals obtain competence with various symbol systems that we are most likely to gain a better understanding of how one becomes a productive member of a community. The development of human symbol systems and symbolizing capacities becomes the essential part of the story if we are to construct a bridge from the raw intelligences to educational practice. Chapter 13, The Education of Intelligences. It is time to beckon back to center stage the three figures first encountered at the opening of this book. The Puluwat youth acquiring his vaunted navigational skills, the young Islamic scholar with his facility for memorization, and the Parisian adolescent composing a work of music at a computer terminal. It was in an effort to understand the skills involved in these disparate feats and the educational processes that develop them that this inquiry was initially undertaken. Having examined the candidate intelligences and begun the process of relating them to the larger society through the use of symbols, the focus must now shift. Where the picture has thus far centered on the developing individual, it must now be examined from the vastly different perspective of the society at large. It is the means a society uses to socialize its members, the various modes of education and training, that will now be the central concern. As the anthropologist Jules Henry reminded us, Homo sapiens has throughout history been a status seeker, and the path he has had to follow by compulsion has been education. In focusing on the educational process, we are considering a domain of utmost importance in all cultures, an optimal area in which to observe the intelligences at work. But as the perspective shifts from the solitary individual to the educational situation as a whole, the mode of presentation must become more descriptive and speculative, a change in tone justified by the urgency of the educational problems facing the world. To analyze any educational encounter, it is essential to consider a framework of its major components. At the forefront are the particular intelligences used, which can serve as both the means of acquiring information through linguistic codes, kinesthetic demonstrations, or interpersonal bonds, and as the message itself, the actual material to be mastered. Related to this are the ways of learning, from the direct, unmediated observation of an adult activity in vivo, to instruction that occurs outside the context in which a skill is practiced, in the special buildings we call schools. Within this equation, one must also account for the media used to transmit knowledge, the sites where learning takes place, and the agents entrusted with the task, from parents and elders in traditional societies to the separate class of professional teachers that emerges in others. Finally, the general cultural context shapes the entire endeavor, determining which intelligences are most highly valued. In traditional non-literate societies, there is a high valuing of interpersonal, spatial, and bodily forms of knowledge. In societies with traditional religious schools, linguistic knowledge comes to be esteemed. And in modern secular educational settings, logical mathematical knowledge is at a premium, along with certain linguistic competences and a new emphasis on intrapersonal forms of understanding. Until a few thousand years ago, nearly all human beings lived in non-literate societies where knowledge was widely shared and acquired through simple observation and imitation. Even in these societies, however, one finds complex, highly elaborated skills restricted to individuals with considerable expertise. Sailing in the Puluwat Islands is an excellent example. The status of master navigator, achieved by only a handful of males, proves extremely difficult to attain. The training, as described by Thomas Gladwin, involves two distinct courses. One is oral and takes place off-site, consisting of the painstaking memorization of vast amounts of factual information, the identities and locations of islands, the courses of the stars, which relies heavily on linguistic intelligence. The more important part of the training, however, can only be acquired through considerable practice at sailing, a first-hand acquaintance with currents and waves that builds up mental models and places a premium on spatial and bodily kinesthetic knowledge. In contrast, the Yugoslavian singer of oral verse learns almost entirely on-site, without formal instruction. He listens night after night to performances, absorbing the plots and, more importantly, the linguistic and musical formulae from which new epics are constructed. While both the sailor and the singer require a capacious linguistic memory, the sailor depends on his spatial and bodily abilities, and the singer on his musical and interpersonal skills. The emergence of such specialized expertise, which cannot be acquired by simple observation, leads societies to develop more formal mechanisms for ensuring that youths with promise are trained to a high level of proficiency. These transitional forms of education stand apart from the normal course of observational learning and anticipate the more formal processes of a schooled society. The initiation rite, a ceremonial occasion marking the transition to adulthood, is less about mastering skills than about understanding one's new role and privileges, a crucial form of knowledge for the development of intrapersonal intelligence. The Bush School, a separate locus where children learn crafts and other important skills, and the apprenticeship system, where a youngster leaves home to live with and learn from a master, represent a progression toward more structured learning. These forms mark a transition from tacit to explicit knowledge, from oral preservation to written communication, and from a religious to a secularized stance. With the rise of formal schools, these trends become fully realized. The regimen of the Quranic school, with its emphasis on the rote memorization of a sacred text in a language unfamiliar to the student, is a powerful example. This practice, however remote it may seem, is characteristic of a range of traditional religious schools that have existed for 1,000 years, from the Hebrew Cheder to the Hindu Gurukula. These schools are almost invariably religious, operated by teachers who are expected to be paragons of virtue. The curriculum is simple. The student must learn to read and write in the language of the sacred texts, a task that relies on rote drill and places linguistic intelligence, especially a keen memory, at a premium. The educational process often centers on a single magnetic figure, a guru, a mullah, a rabbi, and so the interpersonal aspects of learning remain crucial. These schools, rooted in religious practice, are central to the life of the community, but they differ from non-literate modes of education in their relative indifference to spatial and bodily intelligences. The decline of these traditional schools and the rise of the modern secular school, which occurred first in the West, was driven by the development of modern science and the profound social changes of the industrial revolutions. The features of these schools are familiar. They are not centered on religious texts, but treat all knowledge as their province. Teachers are civil servants, chosen for intellectual credentials, not moral fiber. And the overall goals of education are productive labor, citizenship, and personal development. With this shift has come a decided alteration in the mix of intelligences. The importance of interpersonal intelligence has been reduced, as has the need for sheer memorization. Spatial and bodily intelligences are, for the most part, consigned to after-school activities. In their place, an increasing premium is placed on a combination of linguistic and logical mathematical skills, the ability to abstract, synthesize, and criticize, along with a newfound premium on intrapersonal intelligence, as the individual must monitor and plan his own course of study. The hypothetical Parisian student at her home microcomputer stands at the apex of this educational continuum. She can proceed on her own, with remarkably little interaction with others, her work guided by her own planning and a central reliance on logical, mathematical, and intrapersonal abilities. The modern educational setting is defined by a trio of correlated factors: schooling, literacy, and the scientific method. Schooling itself, the practice of acquiring skills out of context through abstract symbolic forms, cultivates mental abilities that are difficult to acquire in on-site, unmediated settings. Literacy, like schooling, encourages a more reflective attention to language and fosters a more abstract form of thinking. But as the research of Sylvia Scribner and Michael Cole with the Vai people of Liberia has shown, it is literacy in the context of schooling that produces widespread cognitive changes, not literacy per se. The third factor, science, is the chief pretender in our times to an altering of worldviews. The scientific method is not a new form of intelligence, but a particular combination of intelligences, a willingness to use linguistic and logical mathematical modes of thought, combined with careful observation to systematically investigate, test, and revise explanatory frameworks. What distinguishes it from traditional ways of knowing is that the system is inherently open to change. Revisiting our three youths, we can see this shift of emphasis clearly. The Puluwat sailor relies primarily on his bodily and spatial capacities. The Iranian scholar is thrown more squarely upon his linguistic capacities, in a setting remote from daily activities, but still deeply interpersonal. The Parisian composer works chiefly alone, with a much greater emphasis on logical, mathematical, and intrapersonal intelligence. It is possible to see this transition as the course of progress, but it is equally possible to see it as a systematic devaluation of certain forms of intelligence. As Socrates feared with the advent of writing, the invention of technological aids may paradoxically leave an individual less prepared to rely on his own abilities. The story of the West is not a universal saga, and a grave mistake has been to assume that it should be. The uncritical attempt to apply the model and history of the West to alien traditions is at the root of many of the most problematic aspects of modernization. Just how to balance these various factors to produce effective educational systems is a most vexing question, but one that this theoretical framework might help to address. Chapter 14: The Application of Intelligences. In April of 1980, a visit to the Suzuki Talent Education Center in Matsumoto, Japan, offered a stunning display of youthful musical talent. The performances were virtually incredible. Children as young as 7 or 8 played movements from violin concerti, and those hardly old enough to hold the instrument performed in startling unison. They played with style, gusto, and accuracy, clearly enjoying themselves and satisfying an audience of mothers leaning forward to catch every bowing. Had one of these preschoolers been heard from behind a curtain, the performance would have been attributed to a much older child, perhaps even a prodigy. And in using that term, one would have been attributing to the luck of heredity what is actually a talent nurtured through a shrewd educational intervention. This is not to say that genetic factors are absent in early musical precocity. The youthful Mozart is a testament to strong hereditary inclination, but the Suzuki students reached such heights because of the ingenuity of the program and the dedication of their parents. Social scientists need a framework that, while acknowledging genetic predisposition, recognizes the formative role of the environment. Talk about the development of intelligence and the realization of human potential is very much in the international air, explored not just by the usual lobbying groups, but also by formidable institutions like the World Bank and national governments. There is a growing conviction that human progress is closely linked to educational opportunities. The World Bank questions exclusive funding for agriculture and calls for investment in human development. The prestigious UNESCO report Learning to Be spoke of the human brain's vast unused potential. The Club of Rome, in its report No Limits to Learning, concurred, recommending innovative learning to bridge the gaps that plague contemporary societies. While laudable in its aspirations, the report remained mired at the level of slogans. Far less circumspect is the platform of Luis Alberto Machado, Venezuela's Minister for the Development of Human Intelligence, who, having concluded that every human has the potential to become a genius, embarked on an ambitious program to transform the nation's educational system from kindergarten to college. The grandiosity of such projects is an inviting target for cynicism, but such hatchet jobs offer little genuine profit. The obligation of the pragmatically oriented social scientist is to offer a better set of tools. Attempts to think about human intelligence must begin with a confrontation of what the human species is actually like. Invocations of no limits to learning are of little utility. It is false to think a human being can do anything. Where everything is possible, there are no guidelines. The 7 core forms of intelligence are an effort to lay out the intellectual regions where most humans have the potential for solid advancement. But these competences never develop in a vacuum. A lengthy educational process is necessary before a raw intellectual potential can be realized in a mature cultural role. This process of transmission is complex, involving the kind of knowledge to be taught, the agents and modes of transmission, and the locus of learning. Through such analysis, it becomes evident that intellectual competences can be mobilized in a variety of ways, serving as both the method of instruction and the subject matter itself. And even if the cognitive mechanisms are in order, educational progress is not guaranteed. Proper motivation, a conducive affective state, and a supporting cultural context are indispensable. The success of the Suzuki music program can be explained through this framework. Devised by the sensitive Japanese violinist Shinichi Suzuki, the talent education program is a carefully structured technique that begins virtually at birth. Crucial to its success is the mother, who is the locus of the program and a vital catalyst for the child's progress. The child is exposed to recordings from the first year of life, then attends group lessons with the mother, where the emphasis is on one's own progress, not competition. At home, the child's interest is deliberately aroused, and only when it has reached a fever pitch is he given his own instrument. Each step of the curriculum is painstakingly structured to advance the child without frustration. Correct performance is constantly modeled, and much is made of repetition and practice, with the child striving to duplicate exactly the sounds on a recording. The avowed goal is not virtuoso performance, but the formation of a strong, positive character, for which music is simply a means to an end. The program's effectiveness depends on more than a shrewd sense of musical development. Suzuki performed a superbly keen analysis of a whole range of factors relevant to skilled performance. He realized the heightened sensitivity of the early years, carefully laying the groundwork through ample exposure long before formal instruction began. He brilliantly exploited the mother-child relationship, using the strong, effective bonds and the principles of interpersonal knowledge to foster a tremendous commitment to the mastery of the violin. The program, however, is not without its costs. Its orientation toward learning by ear often leads to a failure to master sight reading. Its focus on a circumscribed sample of Western music may engender a parochial taste. Its emphasis on slavish imitation of a single interpretation discourages any inclination toward composing or originality. And there are definite personal costs, for both the child who devotes so many hours to a single intelligence and the mother who is expected to devote herself unstintingly to her child's development. The success of the Suzuki program in Japan lies in the comfortable fit between the inclinations of young children and the particular values and institutions of the society. The phenomenal success of Japan in the post-war era has many fathers, but at its core seems to be an effective balance between the maintenance of group feeling and solidarity on the one hand, and individual attainment of proficiency on the other. This balance can be seen in primary school arithmetic classes, where challenging problems are posed to entire classes, who then work together collaboratively over several days, and in large business corporations, where an individual identifies strongly with his firm and has little sense of direct competition with fellow employees. But this system, too, has its costs. The intense pressure to succeed in the academic system, the frankly competitive atmosphere of the juku, cram schools, and a dearth of original scientists from this interpersonally oriented culture. The key to successful educational interventions, whether in Japan, Brazil, or the United States, lies in their fit with the host land. Paulo Freire's literacy program for Brazilian peasants succeeded because it was embedded in a larger program of political action that had profound personal meaning for the students. Sesame Street succeeded in teaching reading to American schoolchildren by building on tried-and-true methods, but delivering them in a commercial-style format and tempo suited to the medium of television. The incidence of failed educational experiments is high, often because of an uncritical attempt to impose a Western-style curriculum on a society with different traditions, as was seen in Iran and China. In the absence of continuity with the past, an educational innovation is unlikely to hold. Any review of pedagogical experiments calls for a close analysis of the educational processes that already exist in a culture. It is always judicious to begin with a review of specific, articulated goals. This should be followed by a sober assessment of the means currently available, including the characteristic blends of intelligences favored by the culture. But a principal assumption of this study is that individuals are not all alike, and that education is best tailored to their particular intellectual profiles. While no technology for this yet exists, a veridical picture can be obtained. Assessment should be age-appropriate. In infancy, strengths and weaknesses can emerge from tests of pattern recognition and memory. In the preschool years, the preferred route is to involve children in motivating activities, puzzles, games, challenges, and to observe their intelligences at work over time. This approach, which can identify crystallizing experiences and markers of early giftedness, differs profoundly from the rapid-fire questions of traditional intelligence testing. Once an intellectual profile has been assessed, the decisive but delicate step of educational planning can be taken. A strategic decision must be made. Does one play from strength, bolster weakness, or both? Then, for each individual, the means must be mobilized to help them attain the desired competence, from an apprenticeship for the highly talented to special prostheses for those with frailties. The idea of matching individuals with particular subject matters and styles of teaching is the vision of an optimal educational experience. The theory of multiple intelligences expands the options for such matches, allowing, for example, a student with a strong musical bent to be introduced to computer programming through the composition of a simple musical piece. These scattered notes are as far as one can go in drawing policy implications from this framework. After the euphoria of the 1960s, we have come to the painful realization that educational problems dwarf our understanding. For every Sesame Street or Suzuki method, there are thousands of failed plans. Nonetheless, the responsibility for developing other individuals remains. It is preferable that those entrusted with this task act not from intuition or ideology, but with some awareness of the alternative methods and outcomes. The hope is that by paying close heed to the biological and psychological proclivities of human beings and to the historical and cultural context in which they live, their efforts can be framed by a growing knowledge of human minds.